Section 5, Chapter 11, The Influence of the Sexes on Vegetation. The marriage of the King and Queen of May intended to promote the growth of vegetation by homeopathic magic. From the preceding examination of the spring and summer, the festivals of Europe, we may infer that our rude forefathers personified the powers of vegetation as male and female, and attempted, on the principle of homeopathic or imitative magic, to quicken the growth of trees and plants by representing the marriage of the sylvan deities in the persons of a king and queen of May, a Whitsuntide bridegroom and bride, and so forth. Such representations were accordingly no mere symbolic or allegorical dramas, pastoral plays designed to amuse or instruct a rustic audience. They were charms intended to make the woods to grow green, the fresh grass to sprout, the corn to shoot, and the flowers to blow. And it was natural to suppose that the more closely the mock marriage of the leaf-clad or flower-decked mummers aped the real marriage of the woodland sprites, the more effective would be the charm. Accordingly, we may assume, with a high degree of probability, that the profligacy which notoriously attended these ceremonies was at one time not an accidental excess but an essential part of the rites, and that the opinion of those who performed them, the marriages of trees and plants, could not be fertile without the real union of the human sexes. At the present day, it might perhaps be vain to look in civilized Europe for customs of this sort observed for the explicit purpose of promoting the growth of vegetation. But ruder races in other parts of the world have consciously employed the intercourse of the sexes as a means to ensure the fruitfulness of the earth, and some rites which are still, or were too lately kept up in Europe, can be reasonably explained only as stunted relics of a similar practice. The following facts will make this plain. Intercourse of the sexes practiced in order to make the crops grow. For 4 days before they committed the seed to the earth, the papails of Central America kept apart from their wives in order that on the night before planting they might indulge their passions to the fullest extent. Certain persons are even said to have been appointed to perform the sexual act at the very moment when the first seeds were deposited in the ground. The use of their wives at that time was indeed enjoined upon the people by the priests as a religious duty, in default of which it was not lawful to sow the seed. The only possible explanation of this custom seems to be that the Indians confused the practice by which human beings reproduce their kind with the process by which plants discharge the same function, and fancying that by resorting to the former they were simultaneously forwarding the latter. In the month of December, when the alligator pears begin to ripen, the Indians of Peru used to hold a festival called Acatemita in order to make the fruit grow mellow. The festival lasted 5 days and nights and was preceded by a fast of 5 days, during which they ate neither salt nor pepper and refrained from their wives. At the festival, men and boys assembled stark naked in open space among the orchards and ran from there to a distant hill. Any woman who they overtook on the way they violated. In some parts of Java, at the season when the bloom will soon be on the rice, the husbandman and his wife visit their fields by night and there occasion sexual intercourse with the purpose of promoting the growth of the crop. In the Leti, Sarmata, and some other groups of islands which lie between the western end of New Guinea and the northern part of Australia, the heathen population regard the sun as the male principle by whom the earth or female principle is fertilized. They call him Upolera, or Mr. Sun, and represent him under the form of a lamp made of coconut leaves, which may be seen hanging everywhere in their houses and in the sacred fig tree. Under the tree lies a large flat stone, which serves as a sacrificial table. On it the heads of slain foes were and are still placed in some of the islands. Once a year, at the beginning of the rainy season, Mr. Sun comes down into the holy fig tree to fertilize the earth, and to facilitate his descent, a ladder with 7 rungs is considerately placed at his disposal. It is set up under the tree as adorned with carved figures of the birds whose shrill clarion heralds the approach of the sun at the east. On this occasion, pigs and dogs are sacrificed in profusion. Men and women alike indulge in a saturnalia, and the mystic union of the sun and the earth is dramatically represented in public, amid song and dance, by the real union of the sexes under the tree. The object of the festival, we are told, is to produce rain, plenty of food and drink, abundance of cattle and children, and riches from Grandfather Sun. They pray that he may make every she-goat to cast 2 or 3 young, the people to multiply, the dead pigs to be replaced by living pigs, the empty rice baskets to be filled, and so on. and to indulge him. To grant their requests, they offer him pork and rice and liquor, and invite him to fall too. In the Bough Islands, a special flag is hoisted at the festival as a symbol of the creative energy of the sun. It is a white cotton about 9 feet high and consists of the figure of a man in appropriate attitude. Among the Tangals of Manipur, before the rice is sown and when it is reaped, the boys and girls have a tug of war with a tough rope or twisted creeper. Great jars of beer are set ready, and the strictness of their ordinary morality is broken by a night of unbridled license. It would be unjust to treat these orgies as a mere outburst of unbridled passion. No doubt they are deliberately and solemnly organized, as essential to the fertility of the earth and the welfare of man. Intercourse of the sex is practiced in order to make trees bear fruit. The same means which are thus adopted to stimulate the growth of the crops are naturally employed to ensure the fruitfulness of trees. The work known as the agriculture of the Nabateans contained apparently a direction that the grafting of a tree upon another tree of a different sort should be done by a damsel, who at the very moment of inserting the graft in the bough should herself be subjected to treatment which can only be regarded as a direct copy of the operation she was performing on the tree. In some parts of Moina, when the state of the clove plantation indicates that the crop is likely to be scanty, the men go naked to the plantations by night, and they seek to fertilize the trees precisely as they would impregnate women, while at the same time they call out for more cloves. This is supposed to make the tree bear fruit more abundantly. In Java, when a palm tree is to be tapped for wine, the man who proposes to relieve the tree of its superfluous juices deems it necessary to approach the palm in the character of a lover and husband, as well as of a son. When he comes upon a palm which he thinks suitable, he will not begin cutting at the trunk until he has imitated, as delicately as he can, the reasons which lead him to perform that surgical operation, and the ardent affection which he cherishes for the tree. For this purpose he holds a dialogue with the palm, in which he naturally speaks in the character of the tree as well as in his own. "O mother and Dangarini," he begins, "for the sake of you I have let myself be drenched by the rain and scorched by the sun. Long have I sought you. Now at last have I found you. How ardently have I longed for you. Often before have you given me the breast, yet I still thirst. Therefore now ask for 4 potfuls more." "Well, fair youth," replies the tree, "I have always been here. What is the reason that you have sought me?" "The reason I have sought you is that I have heard you suffer from incontinentia urinae." "So I do," says the tree. "Will you marry me?" says the man. "That I will," says the tree. "But first you must plight your troth and recite the usual confession of faith." On that the man takes a rattan leaf and wraps it round the palm as a pledge of betrothal, after which he says the creed, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." The maidenly and orthodox scruples of the tree having thus been satisfied, he embraces it as his bride. At first he attaches only a small dish to the trunk to receive the juices which exude from the cut in the bark. A large dish might frighten the tree. In fastening the dish to the palm he says, "Bakentang Rini, your child is languishing away for thirst. He asks you for a drink." The tree replies, "Let him slake his thirst. Others' breasts are full to overflowing." We have already seen that in some parts of northern India, a mock marriage between 2 actors is performed in honour of a newly planted orchard, no doubt for the purpose of making it bear fruit. In the Nicobar Islands, a pregnant woman is taken into the gardens in order to impart the blessing of fertility to the plants. In Uganda, parents of twins are supposed to fertilize the plantains. The Baganda of Central Africa believe so strongly in the intimate relation between the intercourse of the sexes and fertility of the ground that among them a barren wife is generally sent away because she is supposed to prevent her husband's garden from bearing fruit. On the contrary, a couple who have given proof of extraordinary fertility by becoming the parents of twins are believed by the Baganda to be endowed with a corresponding power of increasing the fruitfulness of the plantain trees which furnish them with their staple food. Some little time after the birth of the twins, a ceremony is performed, the object of which clearly is to transmit the reproductive virtue of the parents to the plantains. The mother lies down on her back in the thick grass near the house and places a flower of the plantain between her legs. Then her husband comes and knocks the flower away with his genital member. Further, the parents go through the country performing dances in the gardens of favoured friends, apparently for the purpose of causing the plantain trees to bear fruit more abundantly. The same belief in the fertilizing power of such parents probably explains why in Uganda the father of twins is invulnerable and may go into anybody's garden and take the produce at will. To distinguish him from the common herd, his hair is cut in a special way, and he wears little bells at his ankles which tinkle as he walks. His sacred character is further manifested by a rule which he must observe after the round of visits has been paid and the dances in the gardens are over. He has to remain at home until the next time that the army goes forth to battle, and in the interval he may neither dress his hair nor cut his fingernails. When war has been proclaimed, his whole body is shaved and his nails cut. The clipped hair and nails he ties up in a ball, which he takes with him to the war, along with the bark cloth which he wore at the dances. When he has killed a foe, he crams the ball into the dead man's mouth, ties the bark cloth round his neck, and leaves them there on the battlefield. Apparently the ceremony is intended to rid him of the peculiar sanctity or state of taboo which he contracted by the birth of twins, and to facilitate his return to ordinary life. For to the mind of the savage, as we shall see later on, the sanctity has its dangers and inconveniences, and the sacred man may often be glad to divest himself of it by stripping himself of those separate parts of his person, the hair and nails, to which the holy contagion is apt to cling. Relics of similar customs in Europe. In various parts of Europe, customs have prevailed both at spring and harvest, which are clearly based on the same crude notion that the relation of the human sexes to each other can be so used as to weaken the growth of plants. For example, in the Ukraine on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April, the priest in his robes, attended by his acolytes, goes out to the fields of the village where the crops are beginning to show green above the ground and blesses them. After that, the young married people lie down in couples on the sown fields and roll several times over on them, in the belief that this will promote the growth of the crops. In some parts of Russia, the priest himself is rolled by women over the sprouting crop, and that without regard to the mud and holes which he may encounter in his beneficial progress. If the shepherd resists or remonstrates, his flock murmurs, "Little father, you do not really wish us well. You do not wish us to have corn, although you do wish to live on our corn." In England it seems to have been customary for young couples to roll down a slope together on May Day. On Greenwich Hill the custom was practised at Easter and Whitsuntide, as it was till lately practised near Dublin on Whit Monday. Relics of a custom of promoting the growth of the crops by the intercourse of the sexes. When we consider how closely these seasons, especially May Day and Whitsuntide, are associated with the ceremonies for the revival of plant life in spring, we shall scarcely doubt that the custom of rolling in couples at such times had originally the same significance which it still has in Russia. And when further we compare this particular custom with the practice of representing the vernal powers of vegetation by a bridal pair, and remember the traditions which even in our own country attach to May Day, we shall probably do no injustice to our forefathers if we conclude that they once celebrated the return of spring with grosser rites, of which the customs I refer to are only a stunted survival. Indeed, these rites, in their grossest form, are said to be still observed in various parts of Holland at Whitsuntide. In some parts of Germany at harvest, the men and women who have reaped the corn roll together on the field. This again is probably a mitigation of an older and ruder custom designed to impart fertility to the fields by methods like those resorted to in the papyrus of Central America long ago, and by the cultivators of rice in Java at the present time. In Poso, when the rice crop is not thriving, the farmer's wife sets bowls of rice and betel in various parts of the field. Then she lies down, draws her petticoat over her head, and pretends to fall asleep. But one of her children thereupon mimics the crowing of a cock, and at the sound she gets up, because a new day has dawned. The intention of this ceremony, which the natives could not or would not explain to the Dutch missionary who reports it, may be to place the woman at the disposal of the god of the field. We are expressly told that there is a special god of the rice fields named Bough, and that the ceremony in question is performed in his honor. Continence practiced in order to make the crops grow. To the student who cares to track the devious course of the human mind in its gropings after truth, it is of some interest to observe that the same theoretical belief in the sympathetic influence of the sexes on vegetation, which has led some people to indulge their passions as a means of fertilizing the earth, has led others to seek the same end by directly opposite means. From the moment that they sowed the maize to the time when they reaped it, the Indians of Nicaragua lived chastely, keeping apart from their wives and sleeping in a separate place. They ate no salt and drank neither cocoa nor chica, the fermented liquor made from maize. In short, the season was for them, as the Spanish historians observes, a time of abstinence. To this day, some of the Indian tribes of Central America practice continence, for the purpose of thereby promoting the growth of the crops. Thus we are told that before sowing the maize, the Kachchi Indians slept apart from their wives and ate no flesh for 5 days, while among the Languirinos and Cajabornios, the period of abstinence from these carnal pleasures extends to 13 days. So amongst some of the Germans of Transylvania, it is as a rule that no man may sleep with his wife during the whole of the time that he is engaged in sowing his fields. The same rules observed at Kalotaszeg in Hungary. The people think that if the custom were not observed, the corn will be mildewed. Similarly, a Central Australian headman of the Kaitish tribe strictly abstains from martial relations with his wife all the time that he is performing magical ceremonies to make the grass grow, for he believes that a breach of this rule would prevent the grass seed from sprouting properly. In some of the Melanesian islands, when the yam vines are being trained, the men sleep near the gardens and never approach their wives. Should they enter the garden after breaking this rule of continence, the fruits of the garden would be spoilt. Continence practiced in order to make the crops grow. In the Motu tribe of New Guinea, when rain has fallen plentifully and there is a promise of a good crop of bananas, one of the chief men becomes holy or taboo and must live apart from his wife and eat only certain kinds of food. He bids the young men beat the drum and dance, in order that by doing so there may be a large harvest. If the dancing is not given, there will be an end to the good growth, but if it is continued, all will go well. People come in from other villages to assist and will dance all night. In the Mekio district of British New Guinea, when a taboo was being put on the coconuts and areca nuts to promote their growth, some 14 or 15 men act as watchmen to enforce the taboo. Every evening they go around the village armed with clubs and wearing masks, or so covered with leaves that nobody would know them. All the time they are in office, they may not chew betel nor drink coconut water, lest the areca nuts, which are eaten with betel, and the coconuts should fail. Moreover, they may not live with their wives. Indeed, they may not even look at their woman, and if they pass one, they must keep their eyes on the ground. Among the Kabuis of Manipur, before the rice is sown and when it is reaped, the strictest chastity has to be observed, especially by the religious head of the village, who, besides always taking the omens on behalf of the villagers, is the first to sow and the first to reap. Some of the tribes of Assam believe that so long as their crops remain ungarnered, the slightest incontinence might ruin all. In the incense-growing region of Arabia, in antiquity, there were 3 families charged with the special care of the incense trees. They were called sacred, and at the time when they cut the trees or gathered the incense, they were forbidden to pollute themselves with women or with the contact of the dead. The observance of these rules of ceremonial purity was believed to increase the supply of incense. Apparently, the incense itself was deemed holy. From being gathered, it was deposited in the sanctuary of the sun, where the merchants inspected and purchased it. With ancient Greek husbandmen, it was a maxim that olives should always be planted and gathered by pure boys and virgins. The uncommon fruitfulness of the olive trees of Anaxarabes in Cilicia was attributed to their being tended by young innocent children. In default of such workers, the olive gatherer had to swear that he had been faithful to his own wife, for his fidelity was believed to ensure an abundant crop of fruit the following year. Illicit love supposed to blight the fruits of the earth. Again, the sympathetic relation supposed to exist between the commerce of the sexes and the fertility of the earth manifests itself in the belief that illicit love tends, directly or indirectly, to mar that fertility and to blight the crops. Such a belief prevails, for example, among the Karens of Burma. They imagine adultery or fornication has a powerful influence to injure the harvest. Hence, if the crops have been bad for a year or two and no rain falls, the villagers set down the dirt to secret sins of this kind and say that the God of heaven and earth is angry with them on that account, and they all unite in making an offering to appease him. Further, whenever adultery or fornication is detected, the elders decide that the sinners must buy a hog and kill it. When the woman takes one foot of the hog and the man takes another, and they scrape out furrows in the ground with each foot and fill the furrows with the blood of the hog. Next they scratch the ground with their hands and pray, God of heaven and earth, God of the mountains and hills, I destroy the productiveness of the country. Do not be angry with me, do not hate me, but have mercy on me and compassion on me. Now I repair the mountains, now I heal the hills, and the streams and the lands. May there be no failure of crops, may there be no unsuccessful labours or unfortunate efforts in my country. Let them be dissipated to the foot of the horizon. Make thy paddy fruitful, thy rice abundant, make the vegetables to flourish. If we cultivate but little, still grant that we may obtain a little. After each has prayed thus, they return to the house and say they have repaired the earth. The Baddoes of Sumatra think that even an unmarried woman is big with child, it is necessary to give her in marriage at once, even to a man of lower rank, for otherwise the people will be infested by tigers, and the crops in the field will not yield an abundant return. The crime of incest, in their opinion, would blast the whole harvest if the wrong were not speedily repaired. Epidemics and other calamities that affect the whole people are almost always traced by them to incest, by which is to be understood any marriage that conflicts with their customs. Dayak belief that lewdness may cause bad weather and spoil the crops. Similar views are held by various tribes of Borneo. Thus, when the rain pours down steadily day after day and week after week, and the crops are rotting in the fields, the Dayaks of Borneo come to the conclusion that someone has been indulging in fleshy lusts. So the elders lay their heads together and adjudicate on all cases of incest and bigamy, and purify the earth with the blood of pigs, which appears to possess in a high degree the valuable property of atoning for moral guilt. For 3 days the villages are tabooed and all labour discontinued. The inhabitants remain at home and no strangers are admitted. Not long ago the offenders whose lewdness had thus brought the whole country into danger would have been punished with death or at least slavery. A Dayak may not marry his first cousin unless he first performs a special ceremony called bergabut to avert evil consequences from the land. The couple repair to the waterside, fill a small pitcher with their personal ornaments, and sink it in the river, or instead of a jar they fling a chopper and a plate into the water. A pig is then sacrificed on the bank, and its carcass, drained of blood, is thrown in after the jar. Next the pair are pushed into the water by their friends in order to bathe together. Lastly, a joint of bamboo is filled with pig's blood, and the couple perambulate the country and the villages round about, sprinkling the blood on the ground. After that they are free to marry. This is done, we are told, for the sake of the whole country, in order that the rice may not be blasted. Kayan belief that adultery or fornication spoils the harvest. The Bough or Kayans, a tribe in the interior of Borneo, believe that adultery is punished by the spirits who visit the whole tribe with failure of the crops and other misfortunes. Hence, in order to avert these calamities from the innocent members of the tribe, the 2 culprits with all their possessions are put in quarantine on a gravel bank in the middle of the river. Then, in order thoroughly to disinfect them, pigs and fowls are killed, and with the blood priestess smear the property of their guilty bear. Finally the 2 are set on a raft with 16 eggs and allowed to drift down the stream. They may save themselves by swimming ashore, but this is perhaps a mitigation of an older sentence of death by drowning. Young people shower long grass stalks, which stand for spears at the shamefaced and dripping couple. The Blue Ukayans of the same region similarly imagine that an intrigue between an unmarried pair is punished by the spirits with failure of the harvest, of the fishing, and of the hunt. Hence the delinquents have to appease the wrath of the spirits by sacrificing a pig and some rice. Incest and seduction, supposed to be a cause of bad weather and failure of crops in Celebes. Among the Makassars and Bouginese of southern Celebes, incest is a capital crime. In the Bouginese language, this misdeed is called sapatena, which literally translated signifies that the ground, tenum, has been polluted with the blood of such a person must above all be shunned. Sapa. When we remember how afraid of evil spirits a native is in passing even a spot that has been stained with innocent blood, we can easily conceive what passes in his mind at the thought of the blood of one who has been guilty of such a crime. When the rivers dry up and the supply of fish runs short, when the harvest and the produce of the gardens miscarry, when edible fruits fail, and especially when sickness is rife among the cattle and horses, as well as when civil strife breaks out and the country suffers from any other widespread calamity, the native generally thinks that earth and air have been sullied with the blood of persons who have committed incest. The blood of such people should naturally not be shed. Hence the punishment usually inflicted on them is that of drowning. They are tied up in a sack and thrown into the sea. Yet they kept with them on their journey to eternity the necessary provisions, consisting of a bag of rice, salt, dried fish, coconuts and so on, not forgetting 3 quids a betel. Among the Tamori essential sleeves, a person guilty of incest is throttled. No drop of his blood may fall on the ground, for if it did, the rice would never grow again. The union of uncle and niece is regarded by these people as incest, but it can be expiated by an offering. A garment of the man and one of the woman are laid on a copper vessel. The blood of a sacrificed animal, either a goat or a fowl, is allowed to drip on the garments, and then the vessel with its contents is suffered to float down the river. Among the Talalaki, another tribe of central Celebes, persons who have defiled themselves with incest are shut up in a basket and drowned. No drop of their blood may be spilt on the ground, for that would hinder the earth from ever bearing fruit again. When it rains in torrents, the Galateries of Halmahera say that brother and sister, or father and daughter, or in short some near relations, are having illicit relations with each other, and that every human being must be informed of it, for then only will the rain cease to descend. The superstition has repeatedly caused blood relations to be accused, rightfully or wrongfully, of incest. The people also regard other alarming natural phenomena, for instance a violent earthquake or the eruption of a volcano, as consequences of crimes of the same sort. Persons charged with such offences are brought to turnate. It is said that formerly they were often drowned in the same way, or on being haled thither, were condemned to be thrown into the volcano. Breaches of sexual morality supposed to prevent ruin and so to blight the fruits of the earth in Africa. In some parts of Africa also, it is believed that breaches of sexual morality disturb the course of nature, particularly by blighting the fruits of the earth. Thus the Negroes of Loango suppose that the intercourse of a man with an immature girl is punished by God with drought and consequent famine, until the culprits atone for their sin by dancing naked before the king and an assembly of the people, who throw hot gravel and bits of glass at the pair. For example, in the year 1898, it was discovered that a long drought was caused by the misconduct of 3 girls who were with child before they had passed through what is called the paint house. That is, before they had been painted red and secluded for a time in token that they had attained to the age of puberty. The people were very angry and tried to punish or even kill the girls. Amongst the Baveli of Loango, it is believed that if a man breaks the marriage law by marrying a woman of his mother's clan, God will in like manner punish the crime by withholding the rains in their due season. Similar notions of the blighting influence of sexual crime appear to be entertained by the Nandi of British East Africa. For among them a girl who was being gotten with child by a warrior may never look inside of a granary for fear of spoiling the corn. Among the Basutos likewise, while the corn is exposed to view, all defiled persons are carefully kept from it. If the aid of a man in this state is necessary for carrying home the harvest, he remains at some distance while the sacks are filled, and only approaches to place them upon the drought oxen. He withdraws as soon as the load is deposited at the dwelling, and at no pretext can he assist in pouring the corn to the baskets in which it is preserved. The nature of the defilement which thus disqualifies a man for handling the corn is not mentioned, but probably it would include unchastity. We may conjecture that it was for a similar reason that the Batsogo of Central Africa used to punish severely the seduction of a virgin. If a man was convicted of such a crime and the woman's guilt was discovered, he and she were sent at night time to Kaluba's village, where they were tied to a tree. This tall, spreading incense tree was thought to be under the protection of the spirit called Kakuna Kambuzi. Next morning, the erring couple were discovered by people in the surrounding plantations who released them. They were then allowed to settle near the tree of the protecting spirit. This practice of tying the culprits to a sacred tree may have been thought to atone for their crime and so to ensure the fertility of the earth which they had imperiled. The notion perhaps was to deliver the criminals into the power of the offended tree spirit. If they were found alive in the morning, it was a sign that he had pardoned them. Incest of animals employed as a rain charm in Africa. Curiously enough, the Basoga also held in great abhorrence anything like incest among domestic animals. That is to say, they greatly disapproved of intercourse between a bull calf and its mother cow, or between a bull and a cow that were known to be brother and sister. If this occurred, the bull and cow were sent by night to a fetish tree and tied there. The next morning the chief of the district appropriated the animals and turned them to his own use. Following out the same train of thought, the Torajas of Central Celebes ingeniously employ the incest of animals as a rain charm. For they believe that the anger of the gods at incest or bestiality manifests itself in the form of violent storms, heavy rain or long drought. Accordingly, they think that it is always in their power to enrage the gods by committing incest and so to procure rain when it is needed. However, they abstain from perpetrating the crime among themselves, first because it would be necessary to put the culprits to death, and second because the storms thus raised would be so furious they would do more harm than good. But they fancy that the incest, real or simulated, of animals is a lighter offence, which by discomposing without exasperating the higher powers would disturb the balance of nature just enough to improve the weather. A ceremony of this sort was witnessed by a missionary. Rain was wanted and the headman of the village had to see that it fell. He took his measures accordingly. Attended by a crowd, he carried a cock and a little sow to the river. Here the animals were killed, laid side by side in an intimate embrace and wrapped tightly up in a piece of cotton. Then the headman engaged in prayer. "O gods above and gods below," he said, "if you have pity on us, and will that we eat food this year, give rain. If you will not give rain, well, we have here buried a cock and a sow in an intimate embrace." By which he meant to say, "Be angry at this abomination because we have committed, and manifest your anger in storms." Similar notions of the blight, of effect of sexual crime, may be detected among the civilized races of antiquity, for example among the Jews. These examples suffice to prove that among many savage races, breaches of the marriage laws are thought to blast the fruits of the earth through excessive rain or excessive drought. Similar notions of the disastrous effects of sexual crimes may be detected among some of the civilized races of antiquity, who seem not to have limited the supposed sterilizing influence of such offences to the fruits of the earth, but to have extended it to women and cattle. Thus among the Hebrews we read how Job, passionately protesting his innocence before God, declares that he is no adulterer, for that he says, "Were an heinous crime, yea, it were an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for it is a fire that consumeth unto destruction, and root out all mine increase." In this passage the Hebrew word translated increase commonly means to produce of the earth. And if we give the word its usual sense here, then Job affirms adultery to be destructive of the fruits of the ground, which is just what many savages still believe. This interpretation of his words is strongly confirmed by two narratives in Genesis, where we read how Sarah, Abraham's wife, was taken into the harem by a king who did not know her to be the wife of the patriarch, and how thereafter God visited the king with his household with great plagues, especially by closing up the wombs of the king's wives and his maidservants, so that they bore no children. It was not till the king has discovered and confessed his sin that Abram had prayed God to forgive him, that the king's women again became fruitful. These narratives seem to imply that adultery, even when it is committed in ignorance, is a cause of plague and especially of sterility among women. Again in Leviticus, after a long list of sexual crimes, we read, "Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out from before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do not visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and land vomiteth out her inhabitants." This passage appears to imply that the land itself was somehow physically tainted by sexual transgressions, so that it could no longer support the inhabitants. Blighting effect attributed to incest by the ancient Greeks and Irish. It would seem that the ancient Greeks and Romans entertained similar notions as to the wasting effect of incest. According to Sophocles, the land of Thebes suffered from blight, from pestilence, and from the sterility both of women and of cattle under the reign of Oedipus, who had unwittingly slain his father and wedded his mother, and the Delphic oracle declared that the only way to restore the prosperity of the country was to banish the sinner from it, as if his mere presence withered plants, animals, and women. No doubt the poet of his hearers set down these public calamities in great part to the guilt of parricide, which rested on Oedipus, but they can hardly have failed to lay much also of the evil at the door of his incest with his mother. Again in ancient Italy, under the Emperor Claudius, a Roman noble was accused of incest with his sister. He committed suicide. His sister was banished, and the emperor ordered that certain ancient ceremonies traditionally derived from the laws of King Severus Tullius should be performed, and that expiation should be made by the pontiffs at the sacred grove Diana, probably the famous Arician grove, which has furnished the starting point of our inquiry. As Diana appears to have been a goddess of fertility in general, and of the fruitfulness of women in particular, the atonement made at her sanctuary for incest may perhaps be accepted as evidence that the Romans, like other peoples, attributed to sexual immorality a tendency to blast the fruits both of the earth and of the womb. This inference is strengthened by a precept laid down by grave Roman writers that bakers, cooks, and butlers ought to be strictly chaste and continent, because it was most important that food and cups should be handled either by persons under the age of puberty, or at all events by persons who indulged very sparingly in sexual intercourse. For which reason, if a baker, a cook, or a butler broke this rule of continence, it was his bounden duty to wash in a river of other running water before he applied himself again to his professional duties. But for all such duties, the services of a boy or of a virgin were preferred. The Celts of ancient Ireland similarly believed that incest blighted the fruits of the earth. According to legend, Munster was afflicted in the 3rd century of our era with a failure of the crops and other misfortunes. When the nobles inquired into the matter, they were told these calamities were the result of an incest which the king had committed with his sister. In order to put an end to the evil, they demanded of the king his 2 sons, the fruit of his unholy union, that they might consume them with fire and cast their ashes into the running stream. However, one of the sons, Cork by name, is said to have been purged of his inherited taint by being sent out of Ireland to an island, where a druid purified him every morning by putting him on the back of a white cow with red ears and pouring water over him till one day the cow jumped into the sea and became a rock, no doubt taking the sin of Cork's father away with her. After that, the boy was brought back to Erin. Belief in the blighting effects of incest may have helped to institute the forbidden degrees. Thus, the belief that incest, or a sexual crime in general, has power to blast the fruits of the earth is widespread and probably goes back to a very remote antiquity and may long have preceded the rise of agriculture. We may conjecture that in its origin the belief was magical rather than religious. In other words, that the blood was at first supposed to be a direct consequence of the act itself rather than a punishment inflicted on the criminal by gods or spirits. Conceived as an unnatural union of the sexes, incest might be thought to subvert the regular processes of reproduction, and so to prevent the earth from yielding its fruits, and to hinder animals and men from propagating their kinds. At a later time, the anger of spiritual beings would naturally be invoked in order to give religious sanction to the old taboo. If this was so, it is possible that something of the horror which incest has excited amongst most, though by no means all races of men, sprang from this ancient superstition and has been transmitted as an instinct in many nations long after the imaginary ground of it had been forgotten. Certainly a course of conduct which was supposed to endanger or destroy the general supply of food, and therefore to strike a blow at the very life of the whole people, could not but present itself to the savage imagination as a crime of the blackest dye, fraught with the most fatal consequences to the public weal. How far such a superstition may, in the beginning, have operated to prevent the union of new kin, in other words, to institute the system of prohibited degrees which still prevails among the great majority of mankind, both savage and civilized, is a question which deserves to be considered by the historians of marriage. Explanation of the seeming contradiction in the foregoing customs. If we ask why it is that similar beliefs should logically lead among different peoples to such opposite modes of conduct as strict chastity and more or less open debauchery, the reason, as it presents itself to the primitive mind, is perhaps not very far to seek. If rude man identifies himself in a manner with nature, if he fails to distinguish the impulses and processes in himself on the methods which nature adopts to ensure the reproduction of plants and animals, he may leap to one of 2 conclusions. Either he may infer that by yielding to his appetites he will thereby assist in the multiplication of plants and animals, or he may imagine that the vigour which he refuses to expend in reproducing his own kind will form, as it were, a store of energy whereby other creatures, whether vegetable or animal, will somehow benefit in propagating their species. That's from the same crude philosophy, the same primitive notions of nature and life. The savage may derive, by different channels, a rule either of profligacy or asceticism. Indirect benefit of some of these superstitious customs. To readers bred in a religion which is saturated with the ascetic idealism of the East, the explanation which I have given of the rule of continence observed under certain circumstances by rude or savage peoples may seem far-fetched and improbable. The ascetic view of chastity not understood by the savage. They may think that moral purity, which is so intimately associated in their minds with the observance of such a rule, furnishes a sufficient explanation of it. They may hold with Milton that chastity in itself is a noble virtue, and that the restraint which it imposes on one of the strongest impulses of our animal nature marks out those who can submit to it as men raised above the common herd, and therefore worthy to receive the seal of the divine approbation. However natural this mode of thought may seem to us, it is utterly foreign and indeed incomprehensible to the savage. If he resists on occasion, the sexual instinct is from no high idealism, no ethereal aspiration after moral purity, but for the sake of some ulterior, yet perfectly definite and concrete object, to gain which he is prepared to sacrifice the immediate gratification of his senses. That is, or may be so. The examples I have cited are aptly sufficient to prove. They show that where the instinct of self-preservation, which manifests itself chiefly in the search for food, conflicts or appears to conflict with the instinct which conduces to the propagation of the species, the former instinct, as a primary and more fundamental, is capable of overmastering the latter. In short, the savage is willing to restrain his sexual propensity for the sake of food. Another object for the sake of which he consents to exercise the same self-restraint is victory in war. Not only the warrior in the field, but his friends at home will often bridle their sensual appetites from a belief that by doing so, they will the more easily overcome their enemies. The fallacy of such a belief, or the belief that the chastity of the sower conduces to the growth of the seed, is plain enough to us. Yet perhaps the self-restraint like these and the like beliefs, vain and false as they are, have imposed on mankind has not been without its utility in bracing and strengthening the breed. For strength of character in the race as in the individual consists mainly in the power of sacrificing the present to the future, of disregarding the immediate temptations of ephemeral pleasure for the more distant and lasting sources of satisfaction. The more the power is exercised, the higher and stronger becomes the character. To the height of heroism is reached in men who renounce the pleasures of life, and even life itself, for the sake of keeping or winning for others, perhaps in distant ages, the blessings of freedom and truth. End of chapter 11. Section 6 of The Golden Bough, Part 1, The Magic Art of the Evolution of Kings, Volume 2, by James Frazer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 12, The Sacred Marriage. Part 1, Diana as a Goddess of Fertility. Dramatic marriages of gods and goddesses as a charm to promote vegetation. In the last chapter we saw that according to a widespread belief, which is not without a foundation in fact, plants reproduce their kinds through the sexual union of male and female elements, and that on the principle of homeopathic or imitative magic, this reproduction can be stimulated by the real or mock marriage of men and women, who masquerade for the time being as spirits of vegetation. Such magical dramas have played a great part in the popular festivals of Europe, and based as they are on a very crude conception of natural law, it is clear that they must have been handed down from a remote antiquity. We shall hardly, therefore, err in assuming that they date from a time when the forefathers of the civilized nations of Europe were still barbarians, herding their cattle and cultivating patches of corn in the clearings of the vast forests, which then covered the greater part of the continent from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Ocean. But if these old spells and enchantments for the growth of leaves and blossoms, of grass and flowers and fruit, have lingered down to our own time in the shape of pastoral plays and popular merrymakings, Is it not reasonable to suppose that they survived in less attenuated forms some 2,000 years ago among the civilized peoples of antiquity? Or to put it otherwise, is it not likely that in certain festivals of the ancients we may be able to detect the equivalents of May Day, Whitsuntide and Midsummer celebrations? With this difference, that in those days the ceremonies had not yet dwindled into mere shows and pageants, but were still religious or magical rites, in which the actors consciously supported the high parts of gods and goddesses. Now in the first chapter of this book, we found reason to believe that the priest who bore the title of King of the Wood at Nemai had for his mate the goddess of the grove, Diana herself. May not he and she, as King and Queen of the Wood, have been serious counterparts of the merry mummers who play the King and Queen of May, the Whitsuntide bridegroom and bride in modern Europe? And may not their union have been clearly celebrated in the theogamy, or divine marriage? Such dramatic winnings of gods and goddesses as we shall see presently were carried out as solemn religious rites in many parts of the ancient world. Hence there is no intrinsic improbability in the supposition that the sacred grove at Nemai may have been the scene of an annual ceremony of this sort. Direct evidence that it was so there is none, but analogy pleads in favour of the view, as I shall now endeavour to show. Diana, a goddess of the woodlands. Diana was essentially a goddess of the woodlands, and Ceres was the goddess of the corn, and Bacchus a god of the vine. Sanctity of holy groves in antiquity. Her sanctuaries were commonly in groves, indeed every grove was sacred to her, and she is often associated with the forest god Silvanus in dedications. We must not forget that to the ancients the sanctity of a holy grove was very real and might not be violated with impunity. For example, in Attica there was a sanctuary of Erythasian Apollo, and it was enacted by law that any person caught in the act of cutting trees in it or carrying away timber, firewood or fallen leaves should be punished with 50 stripes if he was a slave, or with a fine of 50 drachmas if he was a freeman. The culprit was denounced by the priest to the king, that is, to the sacred official or minister of state who bore the royal title. Similarly, it was the duty of the sacred maid at Andania in Messenia to scourge slaves and fine freemen who cut wood in the grove of the great goddesses. In Crete it was forbidden, under pain of curses and fines, to fell timber, sow corn, and herd or fold flocks within the precedent of dictator Zeus. In Italy, like customs prevailed. Near Spolitium there was a sacred grove from which nothing might be taken, and in which no wood might be cut except just so much as was needed for the annual sacrifice. Any person who knowingly violated the sanctity of the grove had to expiate his offence by sacrificing an ox to Jupiter, and to pay besides a fine of 300 pence. In his treatise on farming, Cato directs that before thinning a grove, the Roman husbandman should offer a pig as an expiatory sacrifice to the god or goddess of the place, and should entreat his or her favour for himself, his children, and his household. The fratres Arveos, or brethren of the tilled fields, were a Roman college of 12 priests, who performed public religious rites for the purpose of making the crops to grow, and they wore wreaths of ears of corn as a badge of their office. Their sacrifices were offered in their grove of the goddess Dea, situated 5 miles down the Tiber from Rome. So hallowed was this grove, which is known to have included laurels and holy oaks, that expiatory sacrifices of sows and lambs had to be offered when a rotten bough fell to the ground, or when an old tree was laid low by a storm or dragged down by a load of snow on its branches. And still more elaborate expiation had to be made with the slaughter of sows, sheep and bulls when any of the sacred trees were struck by lightning, and it was necessary to dig them up by the roots, split them, burn them, and plant others in their room. At the annual festival of the Parilia, which was intended to ensure the welfare of the flocks and herds, Roman shepherds prayed to be forgiven if they had entered a hollow grove or sat down under a sacred tree, or lopped a holy bough in order to feed a sick sheep on the leaves. Sense of the divinity of woods shared by polite Roman writers. Nor was this sense of the indwelling divinity of the woods confined to the simple rustics who, tending their flocks in the checkered shade, felt the presence of spirits in the solemn stillness of the forest, heard their voices in the sough of the wind among the branches, and saw their handiwork in the fresh green of spring and the fading gold of autumn. The feeling was shared by the most cultivated minds in the greatest age of Roman civilization. Pliny says that the woods were formerly temples of the deities, and even now simple country folk dedicate a tall tree to a god with the ritual of the olden time, and we adore sacred groves and the various science that reigns in them not less devoutly than images that gleam with gold and ivory. Similarly, Seneca writes, if you come upon a grove of old trees that have shot up above the common light and shut out the sight of the sky by the gloom of their matted boughs, you feel there is a spirit in the place, so lofty is the wood, so lone the spot, so wondrous the thick unbroken shade. The breaking of the golden bough, a rite of solemn significance, not a mere peasant's bravado. Thus the ancients, like many other people in various parts of the world, were deeply impressed with the sanctity of holy groves and regarded even the cutting of a bough in them as a sacrilege which called for expiation. If therefore a candidate for the priesthood of Diana Nemite had to break a branch of a certain tree in the sacred grove before he could fight the king of the wood, we may be sure that the act was a rite of solemn significance, and that to treat it as a mere piece of bravado, a challenge to the priest to come on and defend his domain, would be to commit the commonest of all errors in dealing with the past, that namely of interpreting the customs of other races and other generations by reference to modern European standards. In order to understand an alien religion, the first essential is to divest ourselves, as well as we can, of our own familiar prepossessions, and to place ourselves at the point of view of those whose faith and practice we are studying. To do this at all is difficult, to do it completely is perhaps impossible, yet the attempt must be made if the inquiry is to progress instead of returning on itself in a vicious circle. Diana, not a mere goddess of trees, but like Artemis, a personification of the teeming life of nature, both animal and vegetable. But whatever her origin may have been, Diana was not always a mere goddess of trees. Like her Greek sister Artemis, she appears to have developed into a personification of the teeming life of nature, both animal and vegetable. As mistress of the greenwood, she would naturally be thought to own the beasts, whether wild or tame, that ranged through it, looking for their prey in the gloomy depths, munching the fresh leaves and shoots among the boughs, or cropping the herbage in the open glades and dwells. A deity of the woods is naturally the patron of the beasts in the woods, both game and cattle. Thus she might come to be the patron goddess both of hunters and herdsmen. Just as Silvanus was the god not only of woods but of cattle, similarly in Finland the wild beasts of the forest were regarded as the herds of the woodland god Tapio and of his stately and beautiful wife. No man might slay one of these animals without the gracious permission of the divine owners. Hence the hunter prayed to the Sylvan deities and vowed rich offerings to them that they would drive the game across his path. The cattle also seem to have enjoyed the protection of those spirits of the woods, both when they were in the stalls and while they stayed in the forest. So in the belief of Russian peasants, the spirit Leshy rules both the wood and all the creatures in it. The bear is to him what the dog is to man, and the migrations of the squirrels, the field mice and other denizens of the woods are carried out in obedience to his behests. Success in the chase depends on his favour, and to assure himself of the spirit's help, the huntsman lays an offering, generally of bread and salt, on the trunk of a tree in the forest. In White Russia, every herdsman must present a cow to Leshy in summer, and in the government of Archangel some herdsmen have won his favour so far that he even feeds and tends the herds for them. Similarly, the forest god of the Lapps ruled over all the beasts of the forest. They were viewed as his herds, and good or bad luck in hunting depended on his will. So too, the Samogitians deemed the birds and beasts of the woods sacred, doubtless because they were under the protection of the Sylvan god. Before the Gayos of Sumatra hunt deer, the wild goats or wild pigs with hounds in the woods, they deem it necessary to obtain the leave of the unseen lord of the forest. This is done according to a prescribed form by a man who has special skill in woodcraft. He lays down a quid of betel before a stake which is cut in a particular way to represent the lord of the wood. Having done so, he prays to the spirit to signify his consent or refusal. The crowning of hunting dogs on Diana's day was probably a purificatory ceremony to cleanse them from the guilt of having killed game, the creatures of the goddess. We have seen that at Diana's festival it was customary to crown hunting dogs, to leave wild beasts in peace, and to perform a purificatory ceremony for the benefit of young people. Some light is thrown on the meaning of these customs by a passage in Arrian's treatise on hunting. It tells us that a good hound is a boon conferred by one of the gods upon the huntsman, who ought to testify his gratitude by sacrificing to the huntress Artemis. Further, Arrian goes on to say, "It is right that after a successful chase a man should sacrifice and dedicate the first fruits of his bag to the goddess, in order to purify both the hounds and the hunters in accordance with old custom and usage." He tells us that the Celts were wont to form a treasury for the goddess Artemis, into which they paid a fine of 2 bulls for every hare they killed, a drachm for every fox, and 4 drachms for every roe. The crowning of hunting dogs as a form of purification. Once a year, on the birthday of Artemis, they open the treasury, where the accumulated fines purchase a sacrificial victim. It might be a sheep, a goat, or a calf. Having slain the animal and offered her share to the huntress Artemis, they feasted both men and dogs, and they crowned the dogs on that day in order to signify, says Arrian, that the festival was for their benefit. The Celts to whom Arrian, a native of Bithynia, here refers were probably the Galatians of Asia Minor, but doubtless the custom he describes was imported by these barbarians, among with their native tongue and the worship of the oak, from their old home in Central and Northern Europe. The Celtic divinity whom Arrian identifies with Artemis may well have been really akin both to her and to the Italian Diana. We know from other sources that the Celts revered a woodland goddess of this type. Thus Arduina, the goddess of the forest of the Ardennes, was represented, like Artemis Diana, with a bow and quiver. In any case, the custom described by Arrian is good evidence of a belief that the wild beasts belong to the goddess of the wilds, who must be compensated for their destruction, and taken with what he says of the need of purifying the hounds after a successful chase. The Celtic practice of crowning them at the annual festival of Artemis may have been meant to purge them of the stain they had contracted by killing the creatures of the goddess. The same explanation would naturally apply to the same custom observed by the Italians at the festival of Diana. Cattle crowned to protect them from witchcraft. But why, it may be asked, should crowns of garlands cleanse dogs from the taint of bloodshed? The answer to this question is indicated by the reason which the South Slavonian peasant assigns for crowning the horns of his cows with wreaths of flowers on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April. He does it in order to guard the cattle against witchcraft. Cows that have no crowns are regarded as given over to the witches. In the evening, the chaplets are fastened to the door of the cattle stall and remain there throughout the year. A herdsman who fails to crown his beast is scolded and sometimes beaten by his master. The German and French custom of crowning cattle on Midsummer Day probably springs from the same motive. For the Midsummer Eve, just as on Walpurgis Night, witches are very busy holding their nocturnal assemblies and trying to steal the milk and butter from the cows. To guard against them, some people at this season lay besoms crosswise before the doors of the stalls. Others make fast the doors and stop up the chinks, lest the witches should creep through them on their return from the revels. In Swabia, all the church bells used to be kept ringing from 9 at night till break of day on midsummer morning to drive away the infernal rout from honest folks' houses. South Slavonian peasants are up betimes that morning, gather the dew from the grass and wash the cows with it. That saves their milk from the hellish charms of the witches. Similarly, the crowning of hunting dogs may have been meant to protect them against the angry spirits of the beasts they had killed. Now when we observe that garlands of flowers, like hawthorn and other green boughs, are veiled to ward off the unseen powers of mischief, we may conjecture that the practice of crowning dogs at the festival of the huntress goddess was intended to preserve the hounds from the angry and dangerous spirits of the wild beasts which they had killed in the course of the year. Fantastical as this explanation may sound to us, it is perfectly in accordance with the ideas of the savage, who, as we shall see later on, resorts to a multitude of curious expedients for disarming the wrath of the animals whose life he has been obliged to take. Thus conceived, the custom in question might still be termed a purification, but its original purpose, like that of many other purificatory rites, would not be so much to cleanse moral guilt, as to raise a physical barrier against the assaults of malignant and mischievous spirits. Conceived as the moon, Diana was also a goddess of crops and of childbirth. But Diana was not merely a patroness of wild beasts, a mistress of woods and hills, of lonely glades and sounding rivers. Conceived as the moon, especially, it would seem, as the yellow harvest moon, she filled the farmer's grange with godly fruits and heard the prayers of women in travail. In her sacred grove at Nemai, as we have seen, she was especially worshipped as a goddess of childbirth, who bestowed offspring on men and women. Thus Diana, like the Greek Artemis with whom she was constantly identified, may be described as a goddess of nature in general, and of fertility in particular. We need not wonder, therefore, that in her sanctuary on the Aventine she was represented by an image copied from the many-breasted idol of the Ephesian Artemis, with all its crowded emblems of exuberant fecundity. Hence too we can understand why an ancient Roman law, attributed to King Tullius Hostilius, prescribed that, when incest had been committed, an expiatory sacrifice should be offered by the pontiffs in the grove of Diana. For we know that the crime of incest is commonly supposed to cause a dearth. Hence it would be meet that the atonement for the offence should be made to the goddess of fertility. As a goddess of fertility, Diana had herself to be fertile, and for that purpose needed a male partner. Now on the principle that the goddess of fertility must herself be fertile, it behoved Diana to have a male partner. Her mate, if the testimony of service may be trusted, was that Verbius, who had his representative, or perhaps rather his embodiment, in the king of the wood Nemai. The aim of their union would be to promote the fruitfulness of the earth, of animals and of mankind, and it might naturally be thought that this object would be more surely attained if the sacred nuptials were celebrated every year, the parts of the divine bride and bridegroom being played either by their images or by living persons. No ancient writer mentions that this was done in the grove at Nemai, but our knowledge of the Erusian ritual is so scanty that the want of information on this head can hardly count as a fatal objection to the theory. That theory, in the absence of direct evidence, must necessarily be based on the analogy of similar customs practiced elsewhere. Some modern examples of such customs, more or less degenerate, were described in the last chapter. Here we shall consider their ancient counterparts. End of section 6. Section 7, Chapter 12, The Sacred Marriage, Subchapter 2, The Marriage of the Gods. Marriages of the Gods in Babylonia and Assyria. At Babylon, the imposing sanctuary of Bel rose like a pyramid above the city in a series of 8 towers or stories, planted one on top of the other. On the highest tower, reached by an ascent which wound about all the rest, there stood a spacious temple, and in the temple a great bed, magnificently draped and cushioned, with a golden table beside it. In the temple no image was to be seen, and no human being passed the night there, save a single woman who, according to the Chaldean priests, the god chose from among all the women of Babylon. They said that the deity himself came into the temple at night and slept in the great bed, and the woman, as a consort of the god, might have no intercourse with mortal man. As Bel at Babylon was identical with Marduk, the chief god of the city, the woman who thus shared his bed was doubtless one of the wives of Marduk, mentioned in the code of Hammurabi. At Kala, which was for some time the caliph of Assyria before it was displaced by Nineveh, the marriage of the god Nabu appears to have been annually celebrated at the 3rd of the month, Iyar or Ariu, which corresponded to May. For on that day his bed was consecrated in the city, and the god entered his bedchamber to return to his place on the following day. The ceremonies attended the consecration of the couch are minutely described in a liturgical text. After the appropriate offerings have been presented, the officiating priests purified the feet of the divine image with a sprig of reed and a vessel of oil, approached the bed thrice, kissed the feet of the image, then retired and sat down. After that she burned cedar wood dipped in wine, set before the image the heart of a sheep wrapped in a cloth, and offered libations. Aromatic woods were consecrated and burnt. More libations and offerings were made. Tables were spread for various divinities, and the ceremony ended with a prayer to the king. The god also went in procession to a grove, riding in a chariot beside his charioteer. Marriage of the god Ammon to the queen of Egypt. At Thebes in Egypt, a woman slept in the temple of Ammon, as a consort of the god, and like the human wife of Bel at Babylon, she was said to have no commerce with a man. In Egyptian texts, she's often mentioned as the divine consort, and usually she was no less a personage than the Queen of Egypt herself. For according to the Egyptians, their monarchs were actually begotten by the god Ammon, who assumed for the time being the form of the reigning king, and in that disguise had intercourse with the queen. The divine procreation is carved and painted in great detail on the walls of two of the oldest temples in Egypt, those of Deir el-Bahari at Luxor, and the inscriptions attached to the paintings leave no doubt as to the meaning of the scenes. The pictures at Deir el-Bahari, which represent the begetting and birth of the queen, Hatshepsut, and the more ancient, had been reproduced with but little change at Luxor, where they represent the begetting and birth of King Amenophis III. The nativity is depicted in about 15 scenes, which may be grouped in 3 acts. First, the carnal union of the god with the queen. Second, the birth. The third, the recognition of the infant by the gods. The marriage of Ammon with the queen is announced by a prologue in heaven. Ammon summons his ancestors, the gods of Heliopolis, reveals to them the future birth of a new pharaoh, a royal princess, and requests them to make ready the fluid of life and of strength of which they are masters. Then the god is seen approaching the queen's bedchamber. In front of him marches Thoth, with a roll of papyrus in his hand, who, to prevent mistakes, recites the official names of the queen, the spouse of the reigning king, Thothmes I at Deir el-Bahari, Thothmes IV at Luxor, the fairest of women. Then Thoth withdraws behind Ammon, lifting his arm behind the god in order to renew his vital fluid at this critical moment. Next, according to the inscription, the mystery of incarnation takes place. Ammon lays aside his godhead and becomes flesh in the likeness of the king, the human spouse of the queen. The consummation of the divine union follows immediately. On a bed of state, the god and the queen appear seated opposite each other, with their legs crossed. The queen receives from her husband the symbols of life and strength, while 2 goddesses, Neith and Serket, the patroness of matrimony, support the feet of the couple and guard them from harm. The text which encloses the scene sets forth clearly the reality of this mystic union of the human with the divine. Thus Saint Ammon-Ra, king of the gods, lord of Karnak, he who rules over Thebes, when he took the form of this male, the king of Upper and Nether Egypt, Thothmes I or Thothmes IV, giver of life. He found the queen then, when she lay in the glory of her palace. She awoke at the fragrance of the god and marvelled at it. Straightway his majesty went towards her, took possession of her, placed his heart in her, and showed himself to her in his divine form. And upon his coming she was uplifted at the sight of his beauty. The love of the god ran through all her limbs, and the smell of the god and his breath were full of the perfumes of Pelnet. And thus saith the royal spouse, the royal mother Amasi, or Matamoa, in presence of the majesty of this glorious god Ammon, lord of Karnak, lord of Thebes, twice great are thy souls. It is noble to behold thy countenance when thou joinest himself to my majesty at all grace. Thy dew impregnates all my limbs. Then when the majesty of the god had accompanied all his desire with her, Ammon, the lord of the 2 lands, said to her, She who is joined to Ammon, the first of the nobles, verily, such shall be the name of the daughter who shall open thy womb, since such is the course of the words that come forth from thy mouth. She shall reign in righteousness in all the earth, for my soul is hers. Her heart is hers, my will is hers, my crown is hers, truly, that she may rule over the 2 lands, that she may guide the souls of all living. Nativity of the divine Egyptian kings represented on the monuments. After the begetting of the divine child, for we must remember that the kings and queens of Egypt were regarded as divinities in their lifetime, another series of scenes represents the fashioning of its body and its birth. The god Konomo, who in the beginning of time moulded gods and men on his potter's wheel, is seen seated at his wheel, modelling the future king or queen and their doubles, those spiritual duplicates or external souls which were believed to hover invisible about both men and gods all through life. In front of Konomu kneels Hikrit, the frog-headed goddess, the great magician. She is holding out the newly created figures, the symbol of life, the crux ansata, in order that they may breathe and live. Another scene represents the birth. At Deir el-Bahari, the queen has already been delivered, and is presenting her daughter to several goddesses who have acted the part of midwives. At Luxor, the double of the royal infant is born first. The goddesses who serve as nurses have him in their arms, and the midwives are preparing to receive the real child. Behind the queen are the goddesses who watch over childbirth, led by Isis and Nephthys, and all around the spirits of the east, the west and the north, and the south are presenting the symbol of life or uttering acclamations. In a corner of the grotesque god Bes and the female hippopotamus Hapi keep off all evil influence and every malevolent spirit. These representations probably copied from the life. We shall probably not err in assuming with some eminent authorities that the ceremonies of the nativity of the pharaohs, thus emblazoned on the walls of Egyptian temples, were copied from the life. In other words, that the carved and painted scenes represented a real drama, which was acted by masked men and women whenever a queen of Egypt was brought to bed. Here, as everywhere else in Egypt, said Professor Maspero, sculptor and painter, did nothing but faithfully imitate reality. Theory required that the assimilation of the kings to the gods should be complete, so that every act of the royal life was, as it were, a tracing of the corresponding act of the divine life. From the moment that the king was Ammon, he wore the costume and badges of Ammon, the tall hat with the long plumes, the cross of life, the greyhound-headed scepter, and thus arrayed he presented himself in the queen's bedchamber to consummate the marriage. The assistants also assumed the costume and appearance of the divinities whom they incarnated. The men put on masks of jackals, hawks, and crocodiles, while the women donned masks of cows or frogs, according as they played the parts of Anubis, Konomo, Sovko, Hathor, or Hykrit. And I am disposed to believe that the doubles of the newborn child were represented by as many puppets as were required by the ceremonies. Some of the rites were complicated and must have tired excessively the mother and child who underwent them, but they are nothing to those who have been observed in similar circumstances in other lands. In general, we are bound to hold that all the pictures traced on the walls of the temples in which the person of the king is concerned correspond to a real action in which disguised personages played the part of gods. Human wives of Ammon in the decline of Egypt. In the decline of Egypt from the 11th century onwards, the wives of Ammon and Thebes were called on to play a conspicuous part in the government of the country. The strong grip of the pharaohs was relaxed, and under their feeble successors the empire crumbled away into a number of petty independent states. In this dissolution of the central authority, the crafty high priests of Ammon at Thebes contrived to usurp regal powers and to reign far and wide in the name of the deity. Veiling their rescripts under the guise of oracles of the god, who with the help of a little jugglery complacently signified his assent to their wishes by nodding his head or even by speech. But curiously enough, under this pretended theocracy, the nominal ruler was not the priest himself, but his wife, the earthly consort of Ammon. Thus Thebes became for a time a ghostly principality governed ostensibly by a dynasty of female popes. Their office was hereditary, passing by rights from mother to daughter, but probably the entail was often booked by the policy or ambition of the men who stood behind the scenes and worked the religious puppet show by hidden wires to the awe and astonishment of the gaping vulgar. Certainly we know that on one occasion King Psammetichus first foisted his own daughter into the Holy See by dedicating her to Ammon under a hypocritical profession of gratitude for favours bestowed on him by the deity. And the female pope had to submit to the dictation with the best grace she could assume, protesting her affection for the adopted daughter who had ousted her own daughter from the throne. Human concubines of Ammon in Roman times. At a later period when Egypt lay under the heel of Rome, the character of the divine consort of Ammon at Thebes had greatly changed, for at the beginning of our era, the custom was to appoint a young and beautiful girl, the scion of one of the noblest houses, to serve Ammon as his concubine. The Greeks called these maidens Pallades, apparently after their own virgin goddess Pallas. But the conduct of the girls was by no means maidenly, for they led the loosest of lives till puberty. Then they were mourned over and given in marriage. Their graves were shown near Thebes. The reason why their services ended at puberty may have been that as concubines of the god they might not bear children to mortal fathers, hence it was deemed prudent to terminate their relations with the divinity before they were of an age to become mothers. It was an Egyptian doctrine that a mortal woman could conceive by a god, but that a goddess could not conceive by a mortal man. The certainty of maternity and the uncertainty of paternity suggest an obvious and probably sufficient ground for this theological distinction. Apollo and his prophetess at Patara. Apollo was said to spend the winter months at Patara in Lycia and the summer months on the island of Delos, and accordingly he gave oracles for one half of the year in one place and for the other half in the other. So long as he tarried at Patara, his prophetess was shut up with him in the temple every night. The essence of Artemis at Ephesus. At Ephesus there was a college of sacred men called heroines, or king bees, who held office for a year, during which they had to observe strict chastity and other rules of ceremonial purity. How many of them there were at a time we do not know, but there must have been several, for in the Ephesian inscriptions they are regularly referred to in the plural. They cannot have been bound to lifelong celibacy, for in one of the inscriptions the Essen mentions his wife. Possibly they were deemed the annual husbands of Artemis, the great many-breasted goddess of fertility at Ephesus, whose association with the bee is vouched for by the figures of bees which appear commonly both on her statues and on the coins of Ephesus. If this conjecture is right, the king bees and their bee goddess Artemis at Ephesus would be closely parallel to the king of the wood and his woodland goddess Diana at Nemi, as these latter are interpreted by me. The rule of chastity imposed on the king bees during their year of office would be easily explicable on this hypothesis. As the temporary husbands of the goddess, they would be expected for the time being to have no intercourse with mortal women, just as the human wives of Bel and Ammon were supposed to have no commerce with mortal men. Marriage of Dionysus to their queen at Athens. At Athens, the god of the vine, Dionysus, was annually married to the queen, and it appears that the consummation of the divine union, as well as the espousals, were enacted at the ceremony, but whether the part of the god was played by a man or an image we do not know. Attic law required that the queen should be a burgess, and should never have known any man but her husband. She had to offer certain sacred sacrifices on behalf of the state, and was permitted to see what no foreign woman might ever behold, and to enter where no other Athenian might set foot. She was assisted in the discharge of her solemn functions by 14 sacred women, one for each of the altars of Dionysus. The old Dionysiac festival was held on the 12th day of the month Anthestorian, corresponding roughly to our February, at the ancient sanctuary of Dionysus in the marshes, which was never open throughout the year save on that one day. At this festival the queen exacted an oath of purity and chastity from the 14 sacred women at the altar. Possibly her marriage was celebrated on the same day, though of that we have no positive evidence, having learned from Aristotle that the ceremony took place not at the sanctuary in the marshes, but in the old official residence of the king, known as the cattle stall, which stood near the Prytaneum or town hall on the northeastern slope of the Acropolis. But whatever the date of the wedding, its object can hardly have been any other than that of ensuring the fertility of the vines and other fruit trees of which Dionysus was the god. Thus both in form and in meaning that the ceremony would answer to the nuptials of the king and queen of May. Dionysus and Ariadne. Again the story, dear to poets and artists, for the forsaken and sleeping Ariadne, waked and wedded by Dionysus, resembles so closely the little drama acted by French peasants of the Alps on May Day, that considering the character of Dionysus as a god of vegetation, we can hardly help regarding it as the reflection of a spring ceremony like the French one. In point of fact, the marriage of Dionysus and Ariadne was believed by Preller to have been acted every spring in Crete. His evidence indeed is inconclusive, but the view itself is probable. If I am right in comparing the two, the chief difference between the French and the Greek ceremonies appears to have been that in the former, the sleeper was a forsaken bridegroom, in the latter a forsaken bride, and the group of stars in the sky, in which fancy saw Ariadne's wedding crown, may have been only a translation to heaven of the garland worn by the Greek girl who played the Queen of May. Marriage of Zeus with Demeter at Eleusis. If at Athens, and probably elsewhere, the vine god was married to a queen in order that the vines might be loaded with clusters of grapes, there is reason to think that a marriage of a different kind intended to make the fields wave with yellow corn was annually celebrated not many miles off, beyond the low hills that bound the plain of Athens on the west. In the great mystery solemnized at Eleusis in the month of September, the union of the sky god Zeus with the corn goddess Demeter appears to have been represented by the union of the Hierophant with the priestess of Demeter, who acted the parts of god and goddess. But their intercourse is only dramatic or symbolical, for the Hierophant had temporarily deprived himself of his virility by an application of hemlock. The torches having been extinguished, the pair descended into a murky place, while the throng of worshippers awaited in anxious suspense the result of the mystic congress, which they believed their own salvation to depend. After a time the Hierophant reappeared, and a blaze of light silently exhibited to the assembly a reaped ear of corn, the fruit of the divine marriage. Then in a loud voice he proclaimed, "Queen Brimo has brought forth the sacred boy Brimos," by which he meant, "The mighty one has brought forth the mighty." The corn mother in fact had given birth to a child, the corn, and her travail pangs were enacted in the sacred drama. This revelation of the reaped corn appears to have been the crowning act of the mysteries. Thus through the glamour shed round these rites by the poetry and philosophy of later ages, there still looms like a distant landscape through a sunlit haze, a simple rustic festival, designed to cover the wide Eleusinian plain with a plenteous harvest by wedding the goddess of the corn to the sky god, who fertilized the bare earth with genial showers. Marriage of Zeus and Hera at Plataea. But Zeus was not always a sky god, nor did he always marry the corn goddess. Even in antiquity a traveller, quitting Eleusis and passing through miles full of groves and cornfields, had climbed the pine-clad mountains of Cithaeron and ascended through the forest on the northern slope to Plataea. He might have chanced to find the people of that little Boeotian town celebrating a different marriage of the great god to a different goddess. The ceremony described by a Greek antiquary, whose notebook has fortunately preserved for us not a few rural customs of ancient Greece, of which knowledge would otherwise have perished. Every few years, the people of Plataea held a festival which they called the Little Daedala. On the day of the festival, they went out into an ancient oak forest, the trees of which were of gigantic girth. There they set some boiled meat on the ground and watched the birds that gathered round it. When a raven was observed to carry off a piece of the meat and perched on an oak, the people followed it and cut down the tree. With the wood of the tree, they made an image, dressed it as a bride, and placed it on a bullock cart with the bridesmaid beside it. It seems then to have been drawn to the banks of the river Aesopus and back to the town, attended by a piping and dancing crowd. After the festival, the image was put away and kept till the celebration of the great Daedala, which fell only once in 60 years and was held by all the people of Boeotia. On this occasion, all the images, 14 in number, that had accumulated from the celebrations of Little Daedala were dragged on wains in procession to the river Aesopus and then to the top of Mount Cithaeron. There an altar had been constructed of square blocks of wood fitted together with brushwood heaped over it. Animals were sacrificed by being burned on the altar, and the altar itself, together with the images, was consumed by the flames. The blaze, we are told, rose to a prodigious height and was seen for many miles. To explain the origin of the festival, a story ran that once upon a time, Hera had quarreled with Zeus and left him in high dungeon. To lure her back, Zeus gave out that he was about to marry the nymph Plataea, daughter of the river Aesopus. He had a fine oak cut down, shaped and dressed as a bride, and conveyed on a bullock cart. Transported with rage and jealousy, Hera flew to the cart, and tearing off the veil of the pretended bride, discovered the deceit that had been practiced on her. Her rage now turned to laughter, and she became reconciled to her husband Zeus. Resemblance of the Plataean ceremony to the spring and midsummer festivals of modern Europe. The resemblance of this festival to some of the European spring and midsummer festivals is tolerably close. We have seen that in Russia at Whitsuntide the villagers go out into the wood, fell a birch tree, dress it in women's clothes, and bring it back to the village with dance and song. On the third day it is thrown into the water. Again we have seen that in Bohemia on Midsummer Eve the village lads fell a tall fir or pine tree in the wood and set it up on a height where it is adorned with garlands, nosegays and ribbons, and afterwards burnt. The reason for burning the tree will appear afterwards. The custom itself is not uncommon in modern Europe. In some parts of the Pyrenees, a tall and slender tree is cut down on May Day and kept till Midsummer Eve. It is then rolled to the top of a hill, set up and burned. In Angoulême, on St. Peter's Day, the 29th of June, a tall leafy poplar is set up in the marketplace and burned. Near Launceston, in Cornwall, there is a large tumulus known as White Barrow, with a fosse round it. On the tumulus there was formerly a great bonfire on Midsummer Eve. A large summer pole was fixed in the centre, round which the fuel was heaped up. It had a large bush on top of it. Round this were parties of wrestlers contending for small prizes. The rustics believed that giants were buried in such mounds, and nothing would tempt them to disturb their bones. In Dublin on May morning, boys used to go out and cut a May bush, bring it back to town, and then burn it. All such ceremonies were originally magical rites, intended to bring about the effects which they dramatically represented. Probably the Bough festival belonged to the same class of rites. It represented the marriage of the powers of vegetation, the union of the yoke god with yoke goddess, in spring or midsummer. Just as the same event is represented in modern Europe by a king and queen or a lord and lady of the May. In the Boeotian, as in the Russian ceremony, the tree dressed as a woman stands for the English maypole and May Queen in one. All such ceremonies, and must be remembered, are not, or at least were not originally, mere spectacular or dramatic exhibitions. They are magical rites designed to produce the effect which they dramatically set forth. If the revival of vegetation in spring is mimicked by the awakening of a sleeper, the mimicry is intended actually to quicken the growth of leaves and blossoms. If the marriage of the powers of vegetation is simulated by a king and queen of May, the idea is that the powers thus personated will really be rendered more productive by the ceremony. In short, all these spring and midsummer festivals fall under the head of homeopathic or imitative magic. The thing which people wish to bring about they represent dramatically, and the very representation is believed to affect, or at least to contribute to the production of the desired result. In the case of the Daedala, the story of Hera's quarrel with Zeus and her sullen retirement may perhaps without straining be interpreted as a mythical expression for a bad season and the failure of the crops. The same disastrous effects were attributed to the anger and seclusion of Demeter after the loss of her daughter Proserpine. Now the institution of a festival is often explained by a mythical story which relates how upon a particular occasion those very calamities occurred which it is the real object of the festival to avert. So that if we know the myth told to account for the historical origin of the festival, we can often infer from it the real intention with which the festival was celebrated. If therefore the origin of the Daedala was explained by a story of a failure of crops and consequent famine, we may infer that the real object of the festival was to prevent the occurrence of such disasters. And if I am right in my interpretation of the festival, the object was supposed to be effected by dramatically representing the marriage of the divinities most concerned with the production of trees and plants. The marriage of Zeus and Hera was acted at annual festivals in various parts of Greece, and it is at least a fair conjecture that the nature and intention of these ceremonies were such as I have assigned to the Plataean festival of the Daedala. In other words, that Zeus and Hera at these festivals were the Greek equivalents of the Lord and Lady of the May. Homer's glowing picture of Zeus and Hera couched on fresh hyacinths and crocuses, like Milton's description of the delights of Zephyr and Aurora, as he made her once a Maying, was perhaps painted from the life. The god Frey and his human wife in Sweden. The sacred marriage of Zeus and Hera had, as was natural, its counterpart among the northern kinsfolk of the Greeks. In Sweden, every year a life-size image of Frey, the god of fertility, both animal and vegetable, was drawn about the country in a wagon, attended by a beautiful girl who was called the god's wife. She acted also as his priestess in his great temple at Uppsala. Wherever the wagon came with the image of the god and his blooming young bride, the people crowded to meet them and offered sacrifices for a fruitful year. Once on a time, a Norwegian exile named Gunnar Helming gave himself out to be Frey in person and rode about on a sacred wagon dressed up in the god's clothes. Everywhere the simple folk welcomed him as a deity and observed with wonder and delight that a god walked among men and ate and drank just like other people. And when the months went by and the god's fair young wife was seen to be with child, their joy waxed gratefully, for they thought, surely this is an omen of a fruitful season. It happened that the weather was then so mild, and the promise of a plenteous harvest so fair that no man ever remembered such a year before. But one night the god departed in haste, with his wife and all the gold and silver and fine raiment which he had got together, and though the Swedes made after him, they could not catch him. He was over the hills and far away in Norway. Similar customs in Gaul. Similar ceremonies appear to have been observed by the peasantry of Gaul in antiquity, for Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century of our era, says that at autumn the people used to carry about an image of a goddess in a wagon drawn by oxen. The intention of the ceremony was to ensure the safety of the crops and vines, and the rustics danced and sang in front of the image. The old historian identifies the goddess with Cybele, the great mother goddess of Phrygia, and the identification would seem to be correct. For we learn from another source that men, wrought up to a pitch of frenzy by the shrill music of flutes and the clash of cymbals, sacrificed their virility to the goddess, dashing the severed portions of themselves against her image. Now this religious castration was a marked feature of the Phrygian worship of Cybele, but it is alien to Western modes of thought, although it still finds favour with a section of the barbarous, fanatical, semi-oriental peasantry of Russia. But whether of native or of Eastern origin, the rites of the goddess of Autumn closely conform to those of the great Phrygian goddess and appear to have been, like them, a perverted form of the sacred marriage, which is designed to fertilize the earth, and in which eunuchs, strange as it may seem, personated the lovers of the goddess. The custom of marrying gods to images or to living persons is found also among uncivilized peoples. Custom of the Wotyaks. Thus the custom of marrying gods either to images or to human beings was widespread among the nations of antiquity. The ideas on which such a custom is based are too crude to allow us to doubt that the civilized Babylonians, Egyptians, and Greeks inherited it from their barbarous or savage forefathers. This presumption is strengthened when we find rites of a similar kind in vogue among the lower races. Thus, for example, we are told that once upon a time, the Wotyaks of the Myrs district in Russia were distressed by a series of bad harvests. They did not know what to do, but at last concluded that their powerful but mischievous god, Keremet, must be angry at being unmarried. So a deputation of elders visited the Wotyaks of Kura and came to an understanding with them on the subject. Then they returned home, laid in a large stock of brandy, and having made ready a gaily decked wagon and horses, they drove in procession with bells ringing, as they do when they are fetching home a bride, to the sacred grove at Kura. There they ate and drank merrily all night, and next morning they cut a square piece of turf in the grove and took it home with them. After this, though it fared well with the people of Myrs, it fared ill with the people of Kura, for in Myrs the bread was good, but in Kura it was bad. Hence the men of Kura, who had consented to the marriage, were blamed and roughly handled by their indignant fellow villagers. What they meant by this marriage ceremony, says the writer who reports it, is not easy to imagine. Perhaps, as Bechteru thinks, they meant to marry Keremet to the kindly and fruitful Mukailian, the earth wife, in order that she might influence him for good. This carrying of turf, like a bride in a wagon from a sacred grove, resembles the Plataean custom of carting an oak log as a bride from an ancient oak forest. And we have seen ground for thinking that the Plataean ceremony, like its Wotyak counterpart, was intended as a charm to secure fertility. When wells are dug in Bengal, a wooden image of a god is made and married to the goddess of water. Custom of the Peruvian Indians. Often the bride destined for the god is not a log or a clod, but a living woman of flesh and blood. The Indians of a village in Peru have been known to marry a beautiful girl about 14 years of age to a stone shaped like a human being, which they regarded as a god, Huaca. All the villagers took part in the marriage ceremony, which lasted 3 days and was attended with much revelry. The girl thereafter remained a virgin and sacrificed to the idol for the people. They showed her the utmost reverence and deemed her divine. Marriage of a woman to the sun among the Blackfoot Indians. The Blackfoot Indians of North America used to worship the sun as their chief god, and they held a festival every year in his honor. 4 days before the new moon of August, the tribe halted on its march, and all hunting was suspended. Bodies of mounted men were on duty day and night to carry out the orders of the high priest of the sun. He enjoined the people to fast and to take vapor baths during the 4 days before the new moon. Moreover, with the help of his council, he chose a Vestal who was to represent the moon and to be married to the sun at the festival. She might be either a virgin or a woman who had had but one husband. Any girl or woman found to have discharged the sacred duties without fulfilling the prescribed conditions was put to death. On the 3rd day of preparation, after the last purification had been observed, they built a round temple of the sun. Posts were driven into the ground in a circle. These were connected with cross pieces, and the whole was covered with leaves. In the middle stood the sacred pole, supporting the roof. A bundle of many small branches of sacred wood, wrapped in a splendid buffalo robe, crowned the summit of the temple. The entrance was on the east, and within the sanctuary stood an altar on which rested the head of a buffalo. Beside the altar was the place reserved for the Vestal. Here, on a bed prepared for her, she slept the sleep of war, as it was called. Her other duties consisted in maintaining a sacred fire of fragrant herbs, in presenting a lighted pipe to her husband the sun, and in telling the high priest the dream she dreamed during the sleep of war. On learning it, the priest had it proclaimed to the whole nation to the beat of drum. Marriage of girls to fishing nets among the Hurons and Algonquins. Every year about the middle of March, when the season for fishing with the drag net began, the Algonquins and Hurons married their nets to 2 young girls aged 6 or 7. At the wedding feast, the net was placed between the 2 maidens, and was exhorted to take courage and catch many fish. The reason for choosing the brides so young was to make sure that they were virgins. The origin of the custom is said to have been this. One year when the fishing season came round, the Algonquins cast their nets as usual, but took nothing. Surprised at their want of success, they did not know what to make of it, till the soul of genius, Oki, of that appeared to them in the likeness of a tall, well-built man, who said to them in a great passion, I have lost my wife, and I cannot find one who has known no other man but me. That is why you do not succeed, and why you never will succeed till you give me satisfaction on this head. So the Algonquins held a council, and resolved to appease the spirit of the net by marrying him to 2 such very young girls that he could have no ground of complaint on that score for the future. They did so, and the fishing turned out all that could be wished. The thing got wind among their neighbours, the Hurons, and they adopted the custom. A share of the catch was always given to the families of the 2 girls who acted as brides of the net for the year. Sacred marriage of the sun god and earth goddess among the Orions. The Orions of Bengal worship the earth as a goddess and annually celebrate her marriage with the sun god Dharme at the time when the saltry is in blossom. The ceremony is as follows. All bathe, then the men repair to the sacred grove, Sarna, while the women assemble at the house of the village priest. After sacrificing some fowls to the sun god and the demon of the grove, the men eat and drink. The priest is then carried back to the village on the shoulders of a strong man. Near the village, the women meet the men and wash their feet. With beating of drums and singing, dancing and jumping, all proceed to the priest's house, which has been decorated with leaves and flowers. Then the usual form of marriage is performed between the priest and his wife, symbolizing the supposed union between sun and earth. After the ceremony, all eat and drink and make merry. They dance and sing obscene songs and finally indulge in the vilest orgies. The object is to move the Mother Earth to become fruitful. Thus the sacred marriage of the sun and earth, personated by the priest and his wife, is celebrated as a charm to ensure the fertility of the ground. And with the same purpose, or on the principle of homeopathic magic, the people indulge in a licentious orgy. Among the Salka of New Britain, at the village of Colvergat, a certain man has charge of 2 stone figures, which are called respectively our grandfather, Nagur S, and our grandmother, Nagur Pei. They are said to be kept in a house built specially for the purpose. Fruits of the field were offered to them and left beside them to rot. When their guardian puts the 2 figures with their faces turned towards each other, the plantations are believed to flourish. But when he sets them back to back, there is dearth and the people suffer from eruptions on the skin. This turning of the 2 images face to face may be regarded as a simple form of sacred marriage between the 2 divine powers represented by them, who are clearly supposed to control the fertility of the plantations. Marriage of women to gods in India and Africa. At the village of Basdora, in the Gurgaon district of northwestern India, A fair is held on the 26th of the month Chait and the 2 following days. We are told that formerly girls of the Dinwar class used to be married to the god at the festivals, and that they always died soon afterwards. Of late years, the practice is said to have been discontinued. In Bough, during the month of Sawan, August, crowds of women calling themselves Nagin or wives of the snake go about for 2.5 days begging. During this time, they may neither sleep under a roof nor eat salt. Half the proceeds of their begging is given to Brahmins, and the other half spent in salt and sweetmeats which are eaten by all the villagers. Amongst the Iwi-speaking peoples of the Slave Coast in West Africa, human wives of gods are very common. In Dahomey they swarm, and it has even been estimated that every 4th woman is devoted to the service of some deity. The chief business of these female votaries is prostitution. In every town there is at least one seminary, where the handsomest girls between 10 and 12 years of age are trained. They stay for 3 years, learning the chants and dances peculiar to the worship of the gods, and prostituting themselves to the priests and the inmates of the male seminaries. At the end of their novitiate, they become public harlots, but no disgrace attached to their profession, for it is believed that they are married to the god, and that their excesses are caused and directed by him. Strictly speaking, they should confine their favours to the male worshippers of the temple, but in practice they bestow them indiscriminately. Children born of such unions belong to the deity. As the wives of a god, these sacred women may not marry, but they are not bound to the service of the divinity for life. Some only bear his name and sacrifice to him on their birthdays. Amongst these polygamous West African gods, the sacred python seems to be particularly associated with fertility of the earth, for it is invoked in excessively wet, dry and barren seasons, and the time of year when young girls are sought to be his brides is when the millet is beginning to sprout. Women married to water gods. It deserves to be remarked that the supernatural being to whom women are married is often a god or spirit of water. Thus Maklesa, the god of Victoria, the Yanza Lake, who is propitiated by the Baganta every time they undertook a long voyage, had virgins provided for him to serve as his wives. Like the Vestals, they were bound to chastity, but unlike the Vestals, they seem to have been often unfaithful. The custom lasted until Mwanga was converted to Christianity. The Akikuyu of British East Africa worshipped the snake of a certain river, and at intervals of several years they married the snake god to women, but especially to young girls. For this purpose, huts are built by order of the medicine men, who then consummate the sacred marriage with the credulous female devotees. If the girls do not repair to the huts of their own accord in sufficient numbers, they are seized and dragged thither to the embraces of the deity. The offspring of these mystic unions appears to be fathered on God, Nagai. Certainly, there are children among the Akikuyu who pass for children of God. In Kentang, one of the principal Shan states of Upper Burma, the spirit of the Nongtang Lake is regarded as very powerful and is propitiated with offerings in the 8th month, about July of each year. A remarkable feature of the worship of this spirit consists in the dedication of him to 4 virgins in marriage. Custom requires that this should be done once in every 3 years. It was actually done by the late king or chief Soboa in 1893, but down to 1901 the rite has been performed by his successor. The following are the chief features of the ceremony. The virgins who are wed to the spirit of the lake must be of pure Kon race. Orders are sent out for the Kon of the valley to attend. From these unmarried women of suitable age, 10 are selected. These are as beautiful as may be, and must be without spot or blemish. 4 maidens out of the 10 are chosen by lot, and carefully dressed in new garments. A festival is held, usually at the house of the chief minister, where the girls sit on a raised platform. 4 old women, thought to be possessed by spirits, enter and remain as long as the feast lasts. During this time, anything they may want, such as food, betel, or cheroots, is handed to them by the 4 girls. Apparently the old women pass for representatives of the spirit, hence they are waited on by the maidens destined to be his wives. Dotage, blindness, or any great infirmity of age seems to be accounted possession by a spirit for the purposes of this function. When the feast is over, the maidens are formally presented to the spirit, along with the various sacrifices and offerings. They are next taken to the chief's residence, where strings are tied round their waists by the ministers and elders to guard them against ill luck. Usually they sleep a night or two at the place, after which they may return to their homes. There seems to be no objection to their marrying afterwards. If nothing happens to any of the four, it is believed that the spirit of the lake loves them but little, but if one of them dies soon after the ceremony, it shows that she has been accepted by him. The spirit is propitiated with the sacrifice of pigs, fowls, and sometimes a buffalo. Egyptian custom of drowning a girl as a sacrifice to the Nile. In this last custom, the death of the woman is regarded as a sign that the god has taken her to himself. Sometimes, apparently, it has not been left to the discretion of the divine bridegroom to take or leave his human bride. She was made over to him once for all in death. When the Arabs conquered Egypt, they learned that the annual rise of the Nile, the Egyptians were wont to deck a young virgin in gay apparel and throw her into the river as a sacrifice, in order to attain a plentiful inundation. The Arab general abolished the barbarous custom. It is said that under the Tang dynasty the Chinese used to marry a young girl to the Yellow River once a year by drowning her in the water. For this purpose, the witches chose the fairest damsel they could find, and themselves superintended the fatal marriage. At last, the local mandarin, a man of sense of humanity, forbade the custom, but the witches disregarded his edicts and made their preparations for their usual murder. So when the day was come, the magistrate appeared on the scene with his soldiers and had all the witches bound and thrown into the river to drown, telling them that no doubt the god would be able to choose his bride for himself from among them. Girls sacrificed as brides of crocodiles. The Prince of Koapang, a state in the East Indian island of Timor, deemed themselves descended from crocodiles, and on the coronation of a new prince, a solemn sacrifice was made to the crocodiles in presence of the people. The offerings consisted of a pig with red bristles and a young girl prettily dressed, perfumed, and decked with flowers. She was taken down to the bank of the river and set on a sacred stone in a cave. Then one of the prince's guards summoned the crocodiles. Soon one of the beasts appeared and dragged the girl down into the water. The people thought that he married her, and that if he did not find her a maid, he would bring her back. On festival occasions in the same state, a newborn girl was sometimes dedicated to a crocodile, and then with certain ceremonies on consecration, brought up to be married to a priest. It is said that once when the inhabitants of Kayali in Bough, another East Indian island, were threatened with destruction by a swarm of crocodiles, they ascribed the misfortune to a passion which the prince of the crocodiles had conceived for a certain girl. Accordingly, they compelled the damsel's father to dress her in bridal array and deliver her over to the clutches of her crocodile lover. Virgin sacrificed as a bride to the genie of the sea in the Maldive Islands. A usage of the same sort is reported to have prevailed in the Maldive Islands before the conversion of the inhabitants to Islam. The famous Arab traveller Ibn Battuta has described the custom and the manner in which it came to an end. He was assured by several trustworthy natives, whose names he gives, that when the people of the islands were idolaters, there appeared to them every month an evil spirit among the jinn, who came from across the sea in the likeness of a ship full of burning lamps. The wont of the inhabitants, as soon as they perceived him, was to take a young virgin, and have adorned her, to lead her to a heathen temple that stood on the shore, with a window looking out to sea. There they left the damsel for the night, and when they came back in the morning they found her a maid no more, and dead. Every month they drew lots, and he upon whom the lot fell gave up his daughter to the genie of the sea. In time there came to them a Berber named Abu Leberkat, who knew the Quran by heart. He lodged in the house of an old woman of the Isle of Mahal. One day, visiting his hostess, he found that she had gathered her family about her, and that the women were weeping as if there were a funeral. On inquiring into the cause of their distress, he learned that the lot had fallen on the old woman, and that she had an only daughter who must be slain by the evil genie. Abu Abelkat said to the old dame, "I will go this night instead of thy daughter." Now he was quite beardless, so when the night was come, they took him, and after he had performed his ablutions, they put him in the temple of idols. He set himself to recite the Quran, Then the demon appeared at the window, but the man went on with his recitation. No sooner was the genie within hearing of the holy words that he dived into the sea. When morning broke, the old woman and her family and the people of the island came, according to their custom, to carry away the girl and burn her body. They found the stranger repeating the Quran and took him to their king, whose name was Chen-Raza, and made him relate his adventure. The king was astonished at it. The Berber proposed to the king that he should embrace Islam. Chen-Raza said to him, "Tarry with us till next month. If thou shalt do what thou hast done, and shalt escape from the evil genie, I will be converted." The genie of the sea and his bride in the Maldive Islands. The stranger abode with the idolaters, and God disposed the king's heart to receive the true faith. So before the month was out, he became a Mussulman, he and his wives and his children and the people of his court. And when the next month began, the Berber was conducted to the temple of idols, but the demon did not appear, and the Berber set himself to recite the Quran till break of day. And the Sultan and his subjects broke the idols and demolished the temple. The people of the island embraced Islam and sent messages to the other isles, and their inhabitants were converted likewise. But by reason of the demon, many of the Maldive Islands were depopulated before their conversion to Islam. When Ibn Battuta himself landed in the country, he knew nothing of these things. One night, he was going about his business. He heard of a sudden people saying in a loud voice, "There is no God but a God, and God is great." He saw children carrying copies of the Quran on their heads and went beating on the basins and vessels of copper. He was astonished at what they did, and he said, "What has happened?" They answered, "Dost thou not behold the sea?" He looked towards the sea and beheld in the darkness, as it were, a great ship full of burning lamps and crescents. They said to him, "That is the demon. It is his wont to show himself once a month. But after we have done that which thou hast seen, he returns to this place and does us no manner of harm." The story based on the phosphorescence of the sea. It occurred to me that this myth of the demon lover may have been based on some physical phenomenon, electrical, lunar, or otherwise, which is periodically seen at night in the Maldive Islands. Accordingly, I consulted Professor J. Stanley Gardiner, a foremost authority on the archipelago. His answer, which confirms my conjecture, runs thus: a peculiar phosphorescence, like the glow of a lamp hidden by a roughened glass shade, is occasionally visible on lagoon shoals in the Maldives. I imagine it to have been due to some single animal with a greater phosphorescence than any at present known to us. A periodical appearance of some phase of the moon due to reproduction is not improbable and has parallels. The myth still exists in the Maldives, but in a rather different form. He has that a number of these animals might of course appear on some shoal near Mail, the principal island of the group. To the eyes of the ignorant and superstitious, such a mysterious glow, suddenly lighting up the sea in the dusk of the evenings, might well appear a phantom ship, hung with burning lamps, bearing down on the devoted islands, and the stillness of the night, the roar of the surf from the barrier reef might sound in their ears like the voice of the demon calling for its prey. End of Section 7. Section 8, Chapter 12, The Sacred Marriage, Part 3, Sacrifices to Water Spirits. Stories of the Perseus and Andromeda type. Ibn Battuta's narrative of the demon lover and his mortal brides closely resembles a well-known type of folk tale, of which versions have been found from Japan to Annam in the east to Senegambia, Scandinavia, and Scotland in the west. The story varies in details from people to people, but as commonly told, it runs thus. A certain country is infested by a many-headed serpent, dragon, or other monster, which would destroy the whole people if a human victim, generally a virgin, were not delivered up to him periodically. Many victims have perished, and at last it has fallen to the lot of the king's own daughter to be sacrificed. She is exposed to the monster, but the hero of the tale, generally a young man of humble birth, interposes in her behalf, slays the monster, and receives the hand of the princess as his reward. In many of the tales, the monster, who is sometimes described as a serpent, inhabits the water of the sea, a lake, or a fountain. In other versions, he is a serpent or dragon who takes possession of the springs of water and only allows the water to flow or the people to make use of it on condition of receiving a human victim. Water spirits conceived as serpents or dragons. It would probably be a mistake to dismiss all these tales as pure inventions of the storyteller. Rather, we may suppose that they reflect a real custom of sacrificing girls or women to be the wives of water spirits, who are very often conceived as great serpents or dragons. Elsewhere I've cited many instances of this belief in serpent-shaped spirits of water. Here it may be worthwhile to add a few more. Thus, the Warramunga of Central Australia perform elaborate ceremonies to appease or curse a gigantic but purely mythical water snake who is said to have destroyed a number of people. Some of the natives of Western Australia fear to approach large pools, supposing them to be inhabited by a great serpent, who would kill them if they dared to drink or draw water there by night. The Indians of New Granada believed that when the mother of all mankind, named Bachul, was grown old, she and her husband plunged into the lake of Iguagu, where they were changed into two enormous serpents, which still live in the lake and sometimes show themselves. The Yoyampi Indians of French Guiana imagine that each waterfall has a guardian in the shape of a monstrous snake who lies hidden under the eddy of the cascade, but has sometimes been seen to lift up its huge head. To see it as fatal, canoe and Indians are then dragged down to the bottom, where the monster swallows all the men and sometimes the canoe also. Hence the Yoyampians never name the waterfall till they have passed it, for fear that the snake at the bottom of the water might hear its name and attack the rash intruders. The Huicol Indians of Mexico adore water. Springs are sacred, and the gods in them are mothers or serpents that rise with the clouds and descend as fructifying rain. The Tarahumars, another Indian tribe of Mexico, think that every river, pool, and spirit has its serpent, who causes the water to come up out of the earth. All these water serpents are easily offended, hence the Tarahumares place their houses some little way from the water and will not sleep near it when they are on a journey. Whenever they construct weirs to catch fish, they take care to offer fish to the water serpent of the river, and when they are away from home and are making pinole, that is, toasted maize meal, they drop the first of the pinole into the water as an offering to the serpents, who would otherwise try to seize them and chase them back to their own land. In Basutoland, rivers Catane and Meritziane tumble, with a roar of waters and a cloud of iridescent spray into vast chasms hundreds of feet deep. The Basutos fear to approach the foot of these huge falls, for they think that a spirit in the shape of a gigantic snake haunts a seething cauldron which receives the fallen waters. Sacrifices of human beings to water spirits. The perils of the sea, of floods, of rapid rivers, of deep pools and lakes naturally account for the belief that water spirits are fickle and dangerous beings, who need to be appeased by sacrifices. Sometimes these sacrifices consist of animals, such as horses and bulls, but often the victims are human beings. Thus at the mouth of the Bonny River, there is a dangerous bar in which vessels trading to the river have been lost. This is bad for business, and accordingly the Negroes used to sacrifice a young man annually to the spirit of the bar. The handsman's youth was chosen for the purpose, and for many months before the ceremony he lodged with the king. The people regarded him as sacred, or juju, and whatever he touched, even when he passed casually through the streets, shared his sanctity and belonged to him. Hence, whenever he appeared in public, the inhabitants fled before him, lest he should touch their garments or anything they might be carrying. He was kept in ignorance of the fate in store for him, and no one might inform him of it under pain of death. On an appointed day he was taken out to the bar in a canoe and induced to jump into the water. Then the rowers plied their paddles and left him to drown. A similar ceremony used to be performed at the New Calabar River, but the victim was a culprit. He was thrown into the water to be devoured by the sharks, which are there the principal fetish, or juju. The chiefs of Duketown, on the same coast of Guinea, were wont to make an annual offering to the river. A young woman of a light colour, or an albino, was chosen as the victim. On a set day they decked her with finery, took her down to Parrot Island, and, with much ceremony, plunged her in the stream. The fishermen Urfiat at the mouth of the river are still said to observe the right in order to ensure a good catch of fish. The king of Dahomey used to send from time to time a man dressed out with the insignia of office to Wida to be drowned at the mouth of the river. The intention of the sacrifice was to attract merchant ships. When a fisherman is being carried off by a crocodile, some of the natives on the banks of Lake Tanganyika Take this for a sign that the spirit deems himself slighted, since he is obliged to come and find victims for himself instead of having them presented to him. Hence the sorcerers generally decide that a second victim is wanted, so having chosen one, they bind him hand and foot and fling him into the lake to feed the crocodiles. The crater of the volcano Tolucan in Mexico encloses 2 lakes of clear cold water, surrounded by gloomy forests of pine. Here, in the 18th month of the Toltec year, answering to February, children beautifully dressed and decked with flowers and gay feathers used to be drowned as an offering to Tlaloc, the god of the waters, and had a fine temple on the spot. The channels of Anam had traditions of a time when living men were thrown into the sea every year in order to propitiate the deities who looked after the fishing, and when children of good family were drowned in the water channels in order that the rice fields might be duly irrigated. Water spirits considered as beneficent beings who dispense fertility. This last instance brings out a more kindly aspect of the water spirits. If these beings are dreaded by the fisherman and the mariner who tempt the angry sea, and by the huntsman who has to swim or ford the rushing rivers, they are viewed in a different light by the shepherd and the husbandman in hot and arid lands, where the pasture for the cattle and the produce of the fields alike depend on the supply of water, where a prolonged drought means starvation and death for man and beast. To men in such circumstances, the spirits of the waters are beneficent beings, the dispensers of life and fertility, whether their blessings descend as rain from heaven or well up as springs of bubbling water in the parched desert. In the Semitic East, for example, where the rainfall is precarious or confined to certain seasons, the face of the earth is bare and withered for most of the year, except where it is kept fresh by irrigation or by the percolation of underground water. Here accordingly the local gods, or Baalim, had their seats originally in spots of natural fertility, by fountains in the banks of rivers, in groves and tangled thickets and green glades of mountain hollows and deep water courses. As lords of the springs and subterranean waters, they were supposed to be the sources of all the gifts of the land, the corn, the wine and the oil, the wood and the flax, the vines and the fig trees. Water spirits conceived as bestowing offspring on women. When water spirits are thus conceived as the authors of fertility in general, it is natural that they should be held to extend the sphere of their operations to men and animals. In other words, that the power of bestowing offspring on barren women and cattle should be ascribed to them. This ascription comes out clearly in a custom observed by Syrian women at the present day. Some of the channels of the Orontes are used for irrigation, but at a certain season of the year the streams are turned off and the dry bed of the channels is cleared of mud and any other matter that might clog the flow of the water. The first night that the water is turned on again, it is said to have the power of procreation. Accordingly, barren women take their places in the channel, waiting for the embrace of the water spirit in the rush of the stream. Again, a pool of water in a cave at Juna enjoys the same reputation. The people think a childless couple who bathe in the water will have offspring. In India, many wells are supposed to cure sterility, which is universally attributed to the agency of evil spirits. The water of 7 wells is collected on the night of the Diwali, or Feast of Lamps, and barren women bathe in it in order to remove their reproach. There is a well in Orissa, where the priests throw betel nuts into the mud. Childless women scramble for the nuts, and she who finds them will be a happy mother before long. For the same reason, after childbirth, an Indian mother is taken to worship the village well. She walks round it in the course of the sun and smears the platform with red lead, which may be substituted for blood. A Khanda priest will take a childless woman for the meeting of 2 streams, where he makes an offering to the god of births and sprinkles the woman with water in order to rid her of the influence of the spirit who hinders conception. In the Punjab, a barren woman who desires to become a mother will sometimes be let down into a well on a Sunday or Tuesday night during the Diwali festival. After stripping herself of her clothes and bathing in the water, she is drawn up again and performs the Chakpurna ceremony with incantations taught by a wizard. When the ceremony has been performed, the well is supposed to run dry. Its quickening and fertilizing virtue has been abstracted by the woman. The Indian sect of the Vallabhacharyas, or Maharajas, believe that bathing in a sacred well is a remedy for barrenness in women. In antiquity, the waters of Sinusa in Campania were thought to bless childless wives with offspring. To this day, Syrian women resort to hot springs in order to obtain children from the saint or genie of the waters. In Scotland, the same fertilizing virtue used to be, and probably still is, ascribed to certain springs. Wives who wished to become mothers formerly resorted to the well of St. Fillan at Comrie, and to the wells of St. Mary at Whitekirk and in the Isle of May. In the Aran Islands off the coast of Galway, women desirous of children pray at St. Ines Well by the Angel's Walk, and the men pray at the Rag Well by the Church of the Four Comely Ones at Ornott. Charles Well in Oxford was supposed to have the virtue of making barren women to bring forth. Near Bringfield in Northumberland, there is a copious sulphur spring known as the Bough Well. On the Sunday following the 4th day of July, that is about Midsummer's Day, according to the old style, great crowds of people used to assemble at the well from all surrounding hamlets and villages. The scene was like a fair. Stalls for the sale of refreshments being brought and set up for the occasion. The neighbouring slopes were terraced, and seats formed for the convenience of pilgrims and visitors. Barren women prayed at the well that they might become mothers. If their faith was strong enough, their prayers were heard within the year. Love of river spirits for women in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, similar ideas of the procreative power of water meet us in stories of the loves of rivers for women in the legends, which trace the descent of heroes and heroines from river gods. In Sophocles' play of the Trachinian women, Deianira tells how she was wooed by the river Aeschylus, who came to her father and claimed her hand, appearing in the likeness now of a bull, now of a serpent, now of being with the body of a man and the front of an ox, while streams of water flowed from his shaggy beard. She relates too how glad she was how Hercules presented himself and vanquished the river god in single combat and took her to wife. The legend perhaps preserves a reminiscence of that custom of providing a water god with a human wife, which is being practiced elsewhere. The motive of such a custom may have varied with the particular conception which happened to prevail of the character of the water gods. Where he was supposed to be a cruel and destructive being who drowned men and laid waste the country, a wife would be offered simply to keep him in good humour, and so prevent him from doing mischief. But where he was viewed as a procreative power on whom the fertility of the earth and the fecundity of men and animals depended, his marriage would be deemed necessary for the purpose of enabling him to discharge his beneficial functions. This belief in the amorous character of rivers comes out plainly in a custom which was observed at Troy down to classical times. Maidens about to marry were wont to bathe in the Scamander, saying as they did so, "Scamander, take my virginity." A similar custom appears to have been observed at the river Meander, and perhaps in other parts of the Greek world. Occasionally it would seem young men took advantage of the practice to ravage the girls, and the offerings of such a union was fathered on the river god. The bath which a Greek bride and bridegroom regularly took before marriage appears to have been intense to bless their union with offspring through the fertilizing influence of the water nymphs. In Europe, the custom of marrying a woman to a water spirit survives only in tales and pageants. Thus it would appear that in many parts of the world, a custom has prevailed of sacrificing human beings to water spirits, and that, in not a few cases, the ceremony has taken the form of making over a woman to the spirit to be his wife, in order either to pacify his fury or to give play to his generative powers. Where the water spirit was regarded as female, young men might be presented to her for a similar purpose, and this may be the reason why the victims sacrificed to water spirits are sometimes males. Among civilized peoples, these customs survive, for the most part, only in popular tales, of which the legend of Perseus and Andromeda, with its medieval counterpart of St. George and the Dragon, is the most familiar example. But occasionally they appear to leave traces of themselves in ceremonies and pageants. Midsummer custom of slaying the dragon at the Firth in Bavaria. Thus, at Firth in Bavaria, a drama called The Slaying of the Dragon used to be acted every year about midsummer, on the Sunday after Corpus Christi Day. Crowds of spectators flocked from the neighbourhood to witness it. The scene of the performance was the public square. On a platform stood or sat a princess, wearing a golden crown on her head, and as many silver ornaments on her body as could be borrowed for the purpose. She was attended by a maid of honour. Opposite her was stationed the dragon, a dreadful monster of painted canvas stretched on a wooden skeleton and moved by 2 men inside. From time to time the creature would rush into gaping jaws from the dense crowd of spectators who retreated hastily, tumbling over each other in their anxiety to escape. Then a knight in armour, attended by his men-at-arms, rode forth and asked the princess what she did on this hard stone, and why she looked so sad. She told him that the dragon was coming to eat her up. On that the knight bade her be of good cheer, and that for his sword he would rid the country of the monster. With that he charged the dragon, thrusting his spear into its maw, and taking care to stab a bladder of bullock's blood which was there concealed. The gush of blood which followed was an indispensable part of the show, and if the knight missed his stroke he was unmercifully jeered and taunted by the crowd. Having dispatched the monster with sword and pistol, the knight then hastened to the princess, and told her that he had slain the dragon who had so long oppressed the town. In return she tied a wreath round his arm, and announced that her noble father and mother would soon come to give them half the kingdom. The men-at-arms then escorted the knight and the princess to the tavern, there to end the day with dance and revelry. Bohemians and Bavarians came from many miles to witness this play of the slaying of the dragon, and when the monster's blood streamed forth, they eagerly mopped it up, along with the blood-soaked earth, in white cloths, which they afterwards laid on the flax fields, in order that the flax might thrive and grow tall. For the dragon's blood was thought to be a sure protection against witchcraft. This use of the blood suffices to prove that the slaying of the dragon at Firth was not a mere popular spectacle, but a magical rite designed to fertilize the fields. As such, it probably descended from a very remote antiquity, and may well have been invested with the character of solemnity and not of tragedy long before it degenerated into a farce. Saint Romain delivers Ruinen from a dragon. More famous was the dragon from which, according to legend, Saint Romain delivered Rouen, and far more impressive was the ceremony with which, down to the French Revolution, the city commemorated its deliverance. The stately and beautiful edifices of the Middle Ages, which still adorn Rouen, form a fitting background for a pageant which carried the mind back to the days when Henry II of England and Richard Coeur de Lion, Dukes of Normandy, still had their palace in this ancient capital of their ancestral domains. Legend ran that about the year 520 AD, a forest or marsh in the city was infested by a monstrous beast in the shape of a serpent or dragon, which every day wrought great harm to Rouen and its neighbourhood, devouring man and beast, causing boats and mariners on the river Seine to perish, and inflicting other woes innumerable on the Commonwealth. At last the Archbishop, Saint Romain, resolved to beard the monster in his den. He could get none to accompany him but a prisoner condemned to death for murder. On their approach, the dragon made as though he would swallow them up, but the Archbishop, relying on the divine help, made the sign of the cross, and at once the monster became so gentle that he suffered the saint to bind him with his stole, and the murderer to lead him like a lamb to the slaughter. Thus they went in procession to a public place in Rouen, where the dragon was burned in the presence of the people, and its ashes cast into the river. In memory of this deliverance, the Archbishop and Chapter of Rouen were annually allowed to pardon a malefactor on Ascension Day. The murderer was pardoned for his services, and the fame of the deed having gone abroad, Saint Romain, or his successor Saint Ouen, whose memory is enshrined in a church of dreamlike beauty at Rouen, obtained from King Dagobert in perpetuity a privilege for the Archbishop, Dean and Canons of the Cathedral, to wit, that every year on Ascension Day, the anniversary of the miracle, they should pardon and release from prison a malefactor, whomsoever they choose, and whatever the crime of which he had been guilty. This privilege, unique in France, was claimed by the chapter of the cathedral as early as the beginning of the 13th century, for in 1210 the governor of the castle of Rouen, having boggled at giving up a prisoner, the chapter appealed to King Philip Augustus, who caused an inquiry to be made into the claim. In this inquiry 9 witnesses swore that never in the reigns of Henry II and Richard Coeur de Lion, Dukes of Normandy, had there been any difficulty raised on the point in question. Henceforth the chapter seems to have enjoyed the right without opposition down to 1790, when it exercised its privilege of mercy for the last time. Next year the face of things had changed. There was neither Archbishop nor chapter at Rouen. A register of the names of the prisoners who were pardoned together with the accounts of their crimes was kept and still exists. Only a few of the names in the 13th century are known, and there are many gaps in the first half of the 14th century, but from that time onward the register is nearly complete. Most of the crimes to appear to have been murder or homicide. Ceremony of the annual pardon and release of a prisoner at Rouen. The proceedings on the Great Day of Pardon varied somewhat in different ages. The following account is based in great part on a description written in the reign of Henry III and published at Rouen in 1587. 15 days before Ascension Day, the canons of the cathedral summoned the king's officers to stop all proceedings against criminals detained in prison. Afterwards, on the Monday or rogations, 2 canons examined the prisoners and took their confessions, going from prison to prison till the Ascension Day. On that day, about 7 o'clock in the morning, all the canons assembled in the chapter house and invoked the grace of the Holy Spirit by the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus and other prayers. Also they made oath to reveal none of the depositions of the criminals, but to hold them sacred under the seal of confession. The depositions having been taken and the commissioners heard, the chapter, after due deliberation, named him or her among the prisoners who was to receive the benefit of the privilege. A card bearing the prisoner's name and sealed with the seal of the chapter was then sent to the members of Parliament, who were sitting in full assembly, clad in their red robes, in the great hall of the palace to receive the nomination of the prisoner and to give it legal effect. The criminal was then released and pardoned. Immediately the minster bells began to ring, the doors of the cathedral were flung open, the organ pealed, hymns were sung, candles lit, and every solemnity observed in token of joy and gladness. Further, in presence of the conclave, all the depositions of the other prisoners were burnt on the altar of the chapter house. Then the archbishop and the whole of the clergy of the cathedral went in procession to the great square known as the Old Tower near the river, carrying the shrines and reliquaries of the minster, and accompanied by the joyous music of hautboys and clarions. Apparently the Old Tower occupies the site of the ancient castle of the Dukes of Normandy, and the custom of going thither in possession came down from a time when the prisoners were detained in the castle dungeons. In the square there stood, and still stands, a platform of stone raised high above the ground and approached by flights of steps. Thither they brought the shrine, Fayette, of Saint Romain, and thither too was led the pardoned prisoner. He ascended the platform, and after confessing his sins and receiving absolution, he thrice lifted the shrine of Saint Romain, while the innumerable multitude assembled in the square cried aloud. Each time the shrine was lifted, Noel, 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 which was understood to mean God be with us. That done, the procession reformed and returned to the cathedral. At the head walked a beadle clad in violet, who bore on a pole the wicker effigy of the winged dragon of Notre Dame, holding a large fish in its mouth. The whispers and cries excited by the appearance of the monster were drowned in the loud fanfares of cornets, clarions, and trumpets. Behind the musicians, who wore the liveries of the master of the Brotherhood Notre Dame with his arms emblazoned on an ensign of taffeta, came the carved silver-gilt shrine of Notre Dame. After it followed the clergy of the cathedral to the number of 200, clad in robes of violet or crimson silk, bearing banners, crosses, and shrines, and chanting the hymn De Resurrectione Domini. Then came the archbishop, giving his blessings to the great multitude who thronged the streets. The prisoner himself walked behind, bareheaded, crowned with flowers, carrying one end of the litter which supported the shrine of Saint Romain. The fetters he had worn hung from the litter, and with him placed, with lighted torches in their hands, the men and women who, for the last 7 years, had in like manner received their pardon. Now the beadle, in a violet livery, marched behind, bearing aloft on a pole of the wicker effigy of the dragon, Gargoyle, destroyed by Saint Romain. In its mouth the dragon sometimes held a live animal, such as a young fox, a rabbit, or a sucking pig, and it was attended by the Brotherhood of the Gargoylards. The clergy of the 32 parishes of Rouen also took part in the procession, which moved from the old tower to the cathedral amid the acclamations of the crowd, while from every church tower in the city the bells rang out a joyous peal, the great Georges d'Ambrose thundering above them all. After Mass being performed in the cathedral, the prisoner was taken to the house of the master of the Brotherhood of Saint Romain, where he was magnificently feasted, lodged, and served, however humble his rank. Next morning he again presented himself to the chapter, where, kneeling in the presence of a great assembly, he was severely reproved for his sins and admonished to give thanks to God, to Saint Romain, and to the canons for the pardon he had received in virtue of the privilege. History and meaning of the privilege of the Feutre, or shrine of Saint Romain in Rouen. What was the origin and meaning of this remarkable privilege of the Feutre, as the shrine of Saint Romain was called? Its history has been carefully investigated by A. Fouquet, Chief Registrar of the Royal Court of Rouen, with the aid of all the documentary evidence, including the archives both of Rouen and Paris. He appears to have shown conclusively that the association of Saint Romain with the custom is comparatively late. We possess a life of the saints in Latin verse, dating from the 8th century, in which the miracles said to have been wrought by him are set forth in a strain of pompous eulogy. Yet neither in it nor in any of the other early lives of St. Romain and St. Owen, nor in any of the older chronicles and metrologies, is a single word said about the destruction of the dragon and the deliverance of the prisoner. It is not till 1394 that we meet for the first time with a mention of the miracle. Moreover, the deliverance of the prisoner can hardly have been instituted in honour of St. Romain, else it would have taken place on the 23rd of October, the day in which the Church of Rouen celebrates the translation of the saint's bones to the cathedral. St. Romain died in 638, and his bones were transferred to the Cathedral of Rouen at the end of the 11th or the beginning of the 12th century. Further, Flockwood has adduced strong grounds for believing that the privilege claims by the chapter of Rouen of annually pardoning a condemned criminal on Ascension Day was unknown in the early years of the 12th century, and that it originated in the reign of Henry I, or Stephen, if not that of Henry II. He supposes the ceremony to have been, in its origin, a scenic representation of the triumph of Christ over sin and death, the deliverance of the condemned prisoner symbolizing the deliverance of man from the yoke of corruption, and bringing home to the people in a visible form the great mystery which the Festival of the Ascension was instituted to commemorate. Such dramatic expositions of Christian doctrine, he points out, were common in the Middle Ages. Suggested origin of the custom. Plausible as is this solution of the problem, it can scarcely be regarded as satisfactory. Had this been the real origin of the privilege, we should expect to find the Ascension of Christ either plainly enacted or at least distinctly alluded to in the ceremony. But this, so far as we can learn, was not so. Again, would it not savour of blasphemy to represent the sinless and glorified Redeemer by a ruffian stained with the blackest crimes? Moreover, the part played by the dragon in the legend and in the spectacle seems too important to allow us to explain it away, with Floquet as mere symbol of the suppression of paganism by St. Romain. The tale of the conquest of the dragon is older than Christianity, and cannot be explained by it. At Rouen, the connection of St. Romain with the story seems certainly to be late, but that does not prove the story itself to be late also. Judging from the analogy of similar tales elsewhere, we may conjecture that in the Roman version the criminal represents a victim annually sacrificed to a water spirit or other fabulous being, while the Christian saint has displaced a pagan hero, who was said to have delivered the victim from death and put an end to the sacrifice by slaying the monster. Thus it seems possible that the custom of annually pardoning a condemned malefactor may have superseded an older practice of treating him as a public scapegoat who died to save the rest of the people. In the sequel, we shall see that such customs have been observed in many lands. It is not incredible that at Rouen a usage of this sort should have survived in a modified shape from pagan times down to the 12th century, and that the Church should at last have intervened to save the wretch and turn a relic of heathendom to the glory of God in St. Romain. But this explanation of the famous privilege of the fete is put forward with a full sense of the difficulties attending it, and with no wish to dogmatize on so obscure a subject. End of Section 8. Section 9, Chapter 13. The Kings of Rome and Alba. Part 1. Numa and Egeria. Egeria and Nemi, a nymph of water and of the oak, perhaps a form of Diana. From the foregoing survey of custom and legend, we may infer that the sacred marriage of the powers both of vegetation and of water has been celebrated by many peoples for the sake of promoting the fertility of the earth, on which the life of animals and men ultimately depends, and that in such rites the part of the divine bridegroom or bride is often sustained by a man or woman. The evidence may therefore lend some countenance to the conjecture that in the sacred grove of Nemi, where the powers of vegetation and of water manifested themselves in the fair forms of shady woods, tumbling cascades, and glassy lake, a marriage like that of our King and Queen of May was annually celebrated between the mortal King of the Wood and the immortal Queen of the Wood, Diana. In this connection, an important figure in the grove was a mortal nymph Egeria, who was worshipped by a pregnant woman because she, like Diana, could grant them an easy delivery. From this it seems fairly safe to conclude that, like many other springs, the water of Egeria was credited with a power of facilitating conception as well as delivery. The votive offerings found on the spot, which clearly refer to the begetting of children, may possibly have dedicated to Egeria, rather than to Diana, or perhaps we should rather say that the water nymph Egeria is only another form of the great nature goddess Diana herself, the mistress of sounding rivers as well as umbrageous woods, who had her home by the lake and her mirror in its calm waters, and his Greek counterpart Artemis loved to haunt mares and springs. The identification of Egeria with Diana is confirmed by a statement of Plutarch that Egeria was one of the oak nymphs, whom the Romans believed to preside over every green oak grove. For while Diana was a goddess of the woodlands in general, she appears to have been imitedly associated with oaks in particular, especially at the sacred grove of Nemae. Perhaps then Egeria was the fairy of a spring that flowed from the roots of a sacred oak. Such a spring is said to have gushed from the foot of the great oak at Dodona, and from its murmurous flow the priestess drew oracles. Among the Greeks, a drought of water from certain sacred springs or wells was supposed to confer prophetic powers. This would explain the more than mortal wisdom with which, according to tradition, Egeria inspired her royal husband and lover, Numa. The legend of the nuptials of Numa and Egeria may be a reminiscence of a sacred marriage which the kings of Rome contracted with a goddess of water and of vegetation. When we remember how very often in early society the king is held responsible for the fall of rain and the fruitfulness of the earth, it seems hardly rash to conjecture that in the legend of the nuptials of Numa and Egeria we have a reminiscence of a sacred marriage which the old Roman kings regularly contracted with a goddess of vegetation and water for the purpose of enabling him to discharge his divine or magical functions. In such a rite, the part of the goddess might be played either by an image or a woman, and if by a woman, probably by the queen. If there is any truth in this conjecture, we may suppose that the king and queen of Rome masqueraded as god and goddess at their marriage, exactly as the king and queen of Egypt appear to have done. The legend of Numa and Egeria points to a sacred grove rather to a house as a scene of the nuptial union, which, like the marriage of the king and queen of May, or the vine god and the queen of Athens, may have been annually celebrated as a charm to ensure the fertility not only of the earth, but of man and beast. Now, according to some accounts, the scene of the marriage was no other than the sacred grove in Nemae. And on quite independent grounds we have been led to suppose that in that same grove the king of the wood was wedded to Diana. The convergence of the two distinct lines of inquiry suggests that the legendary union of the Roman king with Egeria may have been a reflection or duplicate of the union of the king of the wood with Egeria, or double Diana. This does not imply that the Roman kings ever served as kings of the wood in the Arician grove, but only that they may originally have been invested with a sacred character of the same general kind, and may have held office on similar terms. To be more explicit, it is possible that they reigned not by right of birth, but by virtue of their supposed divinity as representatives or embodiments of a god, and that as such they mated with the goddess, and had to prove their fitness from time to time to discharge their divine functions by engaging in a severe bodily struggle, which may often have proved fatal to them, leaving the crown to their victorious adversary. Our knowledge of the Roman kingship is far too scanty to allow us to affirm any one of these propositions with confidence, but at least there are some scattered hints or indications of a similarity in all these respects between the priests of Nemae and the kings of Rome, or perhaps rather between their remote predecessors in the Dark Ages which preceded the dawn of legend. Part 2. The King as Jupiter. The Roman king seems to have personated Jupiter and wore his costume. In the first place, then, it would seem that the Roman king personated no less a deity than Jupiter himself, for down to imperial times, victorious generals celebrating a triumph and magistrates presiding at the games in their circus, wore the costume of Jupiter, which was borrowed for the occasion from his great temple on the Capitol, and it has been held with a high degree of probability, both by ancients and moderns, that in doing so they copied the traditionary attire and insignia of the Roman kings. They rode a chariot drawn by 4 laurel-crowned horses through the city, where everyone else went on foot. They wore purple robes embroidered or spangled with gold, In the right hand they bore a branch of laurel, in the left hand an ivory scepter topped with an eagle. A wreath of laurel crowned their brows, their face was reddened with vermilion, and over their head a slave held a heavy crown of massy gold fashioned in the likeness of oak leaves. In this attire, the assimilation of the man and the god comes out above all in the eagle-topped scepter, the oaken crown, and the reddened face. For the eagle was the bird of Jove, the oak was his sacred tree, and the face of his image standing in his four-horse chariot on the Capitol was, in like manner, regularly dyed red on festivals. Indeed, so important it was deemed to keep the divine features properly rouged that one of the first duties of the censors was to contract for having this done. The Greeks sometimes painted red the face or the whole body of the wine god Dionysus. These customs may have been a substitute for an older practice of feeding a god by smearing the face, and especially the lips, of his idol with the blood of a sacrificial victim. Many examples of such a practice might be adduced from the religion of barbarous peoples. The oak crown as an emblem of Jupiter and of the Roman emperors. As the triumphal procession always ended in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, it was peculiarly appropriate that the head of the victor should be graced by a crown of oak leaves, for not only was every oak consecrated to Jupiter, but the Capitoline temple of the god was said to have been built by Romulus beside a sacred oak, venerated by shepherds, to which the king attached the spoils won by him from the enemy's general in battle. We are expressly told that the oak crown was sacred to Capitoline Jupiter. A passage of Ovid proves that it was regarded as the god's special emblem. Writing in exile on the shores of the Black Sea, the poet sends the book which he has just composed to Rome to be published there. He personifies the volume and imagines it passing along the sacred way up to the door of the emperor's stately palace on the Palatine Hill. Above the portal hung shining arms and a crown of oak leaves. At the sight, the poet starts, "Is this, quoth I, the house of Jove? Was sure to my prophetic soul the oaken crown was reason good to think it so." The Senate had granted Augustus the right to have the wreath of oak always suspended over his door. And elsewhere Ovid counts this among the more than mortal honours bestowed on the emperor. On the Capitol at Cirta there stood a silver image of Jupiter wearing a silver crown of oak leaves and acorns. Similarly, at Dodona, the most famous sanctuary of the oak in Greece, the image of Zeus appears to have worn a chaplet of oak leaves, for the god is constantly thus portrayed on coins of Epirus. And just as Roman kings appear to have personated the oak god Jupiter, so Greek kings appear to have personated the oak god Zeus. The legendary Salmonius of Elis is certainly reported to have done so. Periphas, the ancient king of Athens, is said to have been styled Zeus by his people, and have been changed into an eagle by his jealous namesake. In Homer, kings are often spoken of as nurtured by Zeus and divine. Indeed, we are told that in ancient days every Greek king was called Zeus. To the Romans, the breach between the human and the divine was not so wide as it seems to us. Thus we may fairly assume that on certain solemn occasions Roman generals and magistrates personated the supreme god, and that in doing so they revived the practice of the early kings. To us moderns, for whom the breach which divides the human and the divine has deepened into the impassable gulf, such mimicry may appear impious, but it was otherwise with the ancients. To their thinking, gods and men were akin, for many families traced their descent from a divinity, and the deification of a man probably seemed as little extraordinary to them as the canonization of a saint seems to a modern Catholic. Roman custom of representing dead ancestors by masked men. The Romans in particular were quite familiar with the spectacle of men masquerading as spirits, for at the funerals of great houses, all the illustrious dead of the family were personated by men specially chosen for their resemblance to the departed. These representatives wore masks fashioned and painted in the likeness of the originals. They were dressed in rich robes of office, resplendent with purple and gold, such as the dead nobles had worn in their lifetime. Like them, they rode in chariots through the city, preceded by the rods and axes, and attended by all the pomp and heraldry of high station. And when at last the funeral procession after threading its way through the crowded streets, defiled into the forum. The maskers solemnly took their seats in ivory chairs placed for them on the platform of the rostra, in the sight of the people, recalling no doubt to the old, by their silent presence, the memories of an illustrious past, and firing the young with the ambition of a glorious future. The kings of Alba seem also to have claimed to represent Jupiter. According to a tradition which we have no reason to reject, Rome was founded by settlers from Alba Longa, a city situated on the slope of the Alban hills, overlooking the lake and the Campagna. Hence the Roman kings claimed to be representatives or embodiments of Jupiter, god of the sky, of the thunder, and of the oak. It is natural to suppose that the kings of Alba, from whom the founder of Rome traced his descent, may have set up the same clan before them. The Silvi and the Julii. Now the Alban dynasty bore the name of Silvi or Wood, and it can hardly be without significance that in the vision of the historic glories of Rome revealed to Aeneas in the underworld, Virgil, an antiquary as well as a poet, should represent all the line of Silvi as crowned with oak. A chaplet of oak leaves would thus seem to have been part of the insignia of the old kings of Alba Longa, as of their successors, the kings of Rome. In both cases, it marked the monarch as the human representative of the oak god. With regard to Silvius, the first king of the Alban dynasty, we are told that he got his name because he had been born or brought up in the forest, and that when he came to man's estate, he contested the kingdom with his kinsman Julius, whose name, as soon as the ancients themselves perceived, means the little Jupiter. Julius the little Jupiter. The people decided in favour of Silvius, but his rival Julius was consoled for the loss of the crown by being invested with religious authority and the office of chief pontiff, or perhaps rather of Flamen Dialis, the highest dignity after the kingship. From this Julius, or little Jupiter, the noble house of the Julii, and hence the first emperors of Rome, believed themselves to be sprung. The legend of the dispute between Silvius and Julius may preserve a reminiscence of such a partition of spiritual and temporal powers in Alba Longa, as afterwards took place in Rome, when the old regal office was divided between the consuls and the king of the sacred rites. Many more instances of such a schism will meet us later on. That the Julian house worshipped Vigilvis, the little Jupiter, according to the ancient rites of Alba Longa, is proved by the inscription on an altar which they dedicated to him at their ancestral home of Bough, a colony of Alba Longa, situated at the foot of the Alban hills. The Caesars, the most illustrious family of the Julian house, took their name from their long hair, Caesares, which was probably, in those early days, as it was among the Franks long afterwards, a symbol of royalty. The Alban kings seem to have been expected to make thunder and rain for the good of their subjects. But in ceding the pontificate to their rivals, it would seem that the reigning dynasty of the Silvi, or Woods, by no means renounced their own claim to personate the god of the oak and the thunder. For the Roman annals record that one of them, Romulus, or Amulius Silvius by name, set up for being a god in his own person, the equal or superior of Jupiter. To support his pretensions and overawe his subjects, he constructed machines whereby he mimicked the clap of thunder and the flash of lightning. Diodorus relates that in the season of fruitage, when thunder is loud and frequent, the king commands his soldiers to drown the roar of heaven's artillery by clashing their swords against their shields. But he paid the penalty for his impurity, for he perished, he and his house, struck by a thunderbolt in the midst of a dreadful storm. Swollen by the rain, the Alban lake rose in flood and drowned his palace. But still, says an ancient historian, when the water is low and the surface unruffled by a breeze, you may see the ruins of the palace at the bottom of the clear lake. Taken along with the similar story of Salmonius, king of Elis, this legend points to a real custom observed by the early kings of Greece and Italy, who, like their fellows in Africa, down to modern times, may have been expected to produce rain and thunder for the good of the crops. The priestly king Numa passed for an adept in the art of drawing down lightning from the sky. Mock thunder, we know, has been made by various peoples as a rain charm in modern times. Why should it not have been made by kings in antiquity? The legends of the deaths of Roman kings point to a close connection between the king and the thunder god. In this connection, it deserves to be noted that, according to the legend, Salmonius, like his Alban counterpart, was killed by a thunderbolt, and that one of the Roman kings, Tullus Hostilius, is reported to have met with the same end in an attempt to draw down Jupiter in the form of lightning from the sky. Aeneas himself, the legendary ancestor of both the Alban and the Roman kings, vanished from the world in a violent thunderstorm, and was afterwards worshipped as Jupiter Indiges. A mound of earth encircled with fine trees on the bank of the little river Numicius was pointed out as his grave. Death and deification of Romulus. Romulus too, the first king of Rome, disappeared in like manner. It was the 7th of July, and the king was reviewing his army at the Goat's Marsh outside the walls of the city. Suddenly the sky lowered and a tempest burst, accompanied by peals of thunder. Soon the storm had swept by, leaving the brightness and serenity of the summer day behind. But Romulus was never seen again. Those who had stood by him said they saw him caught up to heaven in a whirlwind, and not long afterwards a certain Proculus Julius, a patrician of Alban birth and descent, declared an oath that Romulus had appeared to him clad in bright armour, and announced that the Romans were to worship him as a god under the name of Quirinus, and to build him a temple on the spot. The temple was built, and the place was henceforth known as the Quirinal Hill. In this legend it is significant that the enunciation of the king's divinity should be put in the mouth of a member of the Julian house, a native of Alba. We have seen reason to believe that at Alba the Julii had competed with the Silvi, from whom Romulus was descended, for the kingship, and with it the honour of personating Jupiter, if, as seems to be philologically possible, the word Quirinus is derived from the same root as Quercius, an oak. The name of the deified Romulus would mean no more than the oak god, that is, Jupiter. Thus the tradition would square perfectly with the other indications of custom and legend which have led us to conclude that the kings both of Rome and of Alba claimed to embody in their own persons the god of the sky, of thunder, and of the oak. Certainly the stories which associated the deaths of so many of them with thunderstorms point to a close connection with the god of thunder and lightning. A king who had been wont to fulminate in his lifetime might naturally be supposed a death to be carried up in a thunderstorm to heaven, there to discharge above the clouds the same duties which he had performed on earth. Such a tale would be all the more likely to attach itself to the twin Romulus, if the early Romans shared the widespread superstition that twins have power over the weather in general and over rain and wind in particular. That tempests are caused by the spirits of the dead is a belief of the Araucanians of Chile, not storm bursts upon the Andes or the ocean, which the Andes do not ascribe to a battle between the souls of their fellow countrymen and the dead Spaniards. In the roaring of the wind they hear the trampling of their ghostly horses, in the peal of the thunder, the roll of the drums, and the flashes of lightning, the fire of the artillery. Every Latin town probably had its local Jupiter. Thus the kings of Alba and Rome imitated Jupiter as god of the oak by wearing a crown of oak leaves. They seem also to have copied him in his character of a weather god by pretending to make thunder and lightning. And if they did so, it is probable that, like Jupiter in heaven and many kings on earth, they also acted as public rainmakers, wringing showers from the dark sky by their enchantments whenever the parched earth cried out for the refreshing moisture. At Rome, the sluices of heaven were opened by means of a sacred stone, and the ceremony appears to have formed part of the ritual of Jupiter Lycius, the god who elicits from the clouds the flashing lightning and the dripping rain, and who is so well fitted to perform the ceremony as the king and living representative of the sky god. Many local Jupiters in Latinum. The conclusion which we have reached as to the kings of Rome and Alba probably holds good of all the kings of ancient Latinum. Each of them, we may suppose, represented or embodied the local Jupiter, for we can hardly doubt that of old every Latin town or settlement had its own Jupiter, as every town and almost every church in modern Italy has its own Madonna. And like the Baal of the Semites, the local Jupiter was commonly worshipped on high places. Wooded heights, round which the rain clouds gather, were indeed the natural sanctuaries for a god of the sky, the rain, and the oak. Capitoline Jupiter and Juno. At Rome he occupied one summit of the Capitoline Hill, while the other summit was assigned to his wife Juno, whose temple, with a long flight of stairs leading up to it, has for ages been appropriately replaced by the Church of St. Mary in the altar of the sky in Adricele. The hills of Rome were once wooded with oaks. That both heights were originally wooded seems certain, for down to imperial times the saddle which joins them was known as the place between the two groves. Virgil tells us that the hilltop where gilded temples glittered in his day had been covered of old by shaggy thickets, belonging to woodland elves and savage men, born of the tree trunks in the heart of oak. These thickets were probably composed of oaks, for the oak crown was sacred to Capitoline Juno as well as to Jupiter. It was to a sacred oak on the Capitoline that Romulus fastened spoils, and there is evidence that in early times oak woods clothed other of the hills on which Rome was afterwards built. Oak woods on the Roman hills in antiquity. Thus the Caelian hill went originally by the name of the Mountain of the Oak Grove on account of the thicket of oak by which it was overgrown, and Jupiter was here worshipped in his character of the oak god. One of the old gates of Rome, apparently between the Caelian and the Aquiline hills, was called the Gate of the Oak Grove for a similar reason, and within the walls hard by was a chapel of the Oak Grove dedicated to the worship of the oak nymphs. These nymphs appear on coins of the Aquilean family as three women supporting on their shoulders a pole from which rise leafy branches. The Esquiline hill seems also to have derived its name from its oaks. After mentioning the chapel of the oak and other hallowed groves which still dotted the hill in his time, the antiquary Varro tells us that their bounds were now much curtailed, adding on the side that it was no wonder the sacred old trees should give way to the modern worship of Mammon. Apparently, the Roman nobles of those days sold the ancient woods, and their descendants sell their beautiful gardens for building land. To this list of oak-clad hills on the left bank of the Tiber must be added the Quirinal, if Quirinus, who had a very ancient shrine on the hill, was the oak god. Under the Aventine was a grove of evergreen oaks, which appears to have been no other than the grove of Vigeria outside the Porta Capena. The sacred Vestal fire fed with oak wood. The old grove of Vesta, which once skirted the foot of the Palatine Hill on the side of the Forum, must surely have been a grove of oaks. For not only does an oak appear growing beside the temple of Vesta on a fine relief preserved in the gallery of the Uffizi at Florence, but charred embers of this sacred Vestal fire have in recent years been discovered at the temple of Vesta in the Forum, and a microscopic analysis of them has proved that they consist of the pith of heart of trunks or great branches of oak, quercus. The full significance of this discovery will appear later on. When the plebeians seceded to the Janiculum in the 3rd century before Christ, the dictator Q. Hortensius summoned a meeting of the people and passed a law in an oak grove which perhaps grew on the hill. In this neighbourhood there was a street called the Street of the Oak Grove. It is mentioned in an inscription found in its original position near the modern Garibaldi Bridge. On the Vatican Hill there stood an evergreen oak which was believed to be older than Rome. An inscription in Etruscan letters on a bronze tablet proclaims the sanctity of the tree. Finally, that oak woods existed at or near Rome in the earliest times has lately been demonstrated by the discovery in the Forum itself of a prehistoric cemetery, which contains, amongst other sepultures of bones of several young children deposited in rudely hollowed trunks of oak. With all this evidence before us, we need not wonder that Virgil should speak of the primitive inhabitants of Rome as born of the tree trunks and the heart of oak, and that Roman kings should have worn crowns of oak leaves in imitation of the oak god Jupiter who dwelt in his sacred grove on the Capitol. The Alban kings may have imitated Latian Jupiter who dwelt on the top of the Alban Mount. If the kings of Rome aped Capitoline Jove, their predecessors, the kings of Alba, probably laid themselves out to mimic the great Latian Jupiter who had his seat above the city on the summit of the Alban mountain. Latinus, the legendary ancestor of the dynasty, was said to have been changed into Latian Jupiter after vanishing from the world in the mysterious fashion characteristic of the old Latin kings. The sanctuary of the god on top of the mountain was a religious centre of the Latin League, as Alba was its political capital till Rome wrested the supremacy from its ancient rival. Apparently no temple, in our sense of the word, was ever erected to Jupiter on this his holy mountain, as god of the sky and thunder, he appropriately received the homage of his worshippers in the open air. The massive wall, of which some remains still enclose the old garden of the Passionist monastery, seems to have been part of the sacred precinct which Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome, marked out for the solemn annual assembly of the Latin League. The god's oldest sanctuary on this airy mountain top was a grove, and bearing in mind not merely the special consecration of the oak of Jupiter, but also the traditional oak crown of the Alban kings, and the allergy of the Capitoline Jupiter at Rome, we may suppose that the trees in the grove were oaks. The woods of Latinum in antiquity. We know that in antiquity, Mount Algidus, an outlying group of the Alban hills, was covered with dark forests of oak. And among the tribes who belonged to the Latin League in the earliest days and were entitled to share the flesh of the white bulls sacrificed on the Alban Mount, there was one whose members styled themselves the Men of the Oak, doubtless on account of the woods among which they dwelt. Theophorastus's description of the woods of Latinum. But we should err if we picture to ourselves a country as covered in historical times with an unbroken forest of oaks. Theophrastus has left us a description of the woods of Latium as they were in the 4th century before Christ. He says, the land of the Latins is all moist. The plains produced laurels, myrtles, and wonderful beeches, for they felled trees of such a size that a single stem suffices for the keel of a Tyrrhenian ship. Pines and firs grow in the mountains. What they call the land of Circe is a lofty headland thickly wooded with oak, myrtle, and luxuriant laurels. The natives say that Circe dwelt there, and they show the grave of Elpenor, from which grow myrtles such as wreaths are made of, whereas the other myrtle trees are tall. The prospect from the Alban Mount in antiquity. Thus a prospect from the top of the Alban Mount in the early days of Rome must have been very different in some respects from what it is today. The purple Apennines, indeed, in their eternal calm on the one hand, and the shining Mediterranean in its eternal unrest on the other, no doubt looked then much as they look now, whether bathed in sunshine or checkered by the fleeting shadows of clouds, but instead of the desolate brown expanse of the fever-stricken Campagna, spanned by its long lines of ruined aqueducts, like the broken arches of the bridge in the vision of Mirza, the eye must have ranged over woodlands that stretched away, mile after mile, on all sides, to the varied hues of green or autumnal scarlet and gold, melted insensibly into the blue of the distant mountains and sea. Thus the Alban Mount was to the Latins what Olympus was to the Greeks, the lofty abode of the sky god who hurled his thunderbolts from above the clouds. Resemblance between the Latin worship of Jupiter and the Drusidical worship of the oak. The white steers which we hear sacrificed to him in his sacred grove, as in the capital of Rome, remind us of the white bulls which the Druids of Gaul sacrificed under the holy oak when they cut the mistletoe. And the parallel would be all the closer if, as we have seen reason to think, the Latins worshipped Jupiter originally in groves of oak. Other resemblances between ancient Gaul and Latinum will meet us later on, when we remember that the ancient Italian and Celtic peoples spoke languages which are nearly related to each other. We shall not be surprised at discovering traces of community in their religion, especially in what concerns the worship of the god, of the oak, and the thunder. For that worship, as we shall see presently, belongs to the oldest stratum of Aryan civilization in Europe. Sacred marriage of Jupiter and Juno. But Jupiter did not reign alone on the top of his holy mountain. He had his consort with him, the goddess Juno, who was worshipped here under the same title, Moneta, as on the capital of Rome. As the oak crown was sacred to Jupiter and Juno on the capital, so we may suppose it was the Alban Mount from which the Capitoline worship was derived. Thus the oak god would have his oak goddess in the sacred oak grove. So at Dodona the oak god Zeus was coupled with Dione, whose very name is only a dialectically different form of Juno, and so on the top of Mount Cithaeron he was periodically wedded to an oaken image of Hera. It is probable, though it cannot be positively proved, that the sacred marriage of Jupiter and Juno was annually celebrated by all the peoples of the Latin stock in the month which they named after the goddess, the midsummer month of June. Janus and Carna. Now on the 1st of June, the Roman pontiffs performed certain rites in the grove of Heroines beside the Tiber, and on the same day, and perhaps in the same place, a nymph for the grove, by name Carna, received offerings of lard and bean porridge. She was said to be a huntress, chaste and coy, who gave the slip to her lovers in the depth of the wood, but was caught by Janus. Some took her to be Diana herself. If she were indeed a form of that goddess, her union with Janus, that is, Dianas, would be inappropriate, and as she had a chapel on the Caelian hill, which was once covered with oak woods, she may have been like Egeria, an oak nymph. Further, Janus, Dianas, and Diana, as we shall see later on, were originally more doubles of Jupiter and Juno, with whom they coincide in name and to some extent in function. Hence it appears to be not impossible that the rite celebrated by the pontiffs on the 1st of June in the sacred grove of Heroines was a marriage of Jupiter and Juno under the form of Janus and Diana. Ancient use of whitethorn or buckthorn to ward off witchcraft. It would be some confirmation of this view if we could be sure that, as Ovid seems to imply, the Romans were in the habit of placing branches of whitethorn or buckthorn in their windows on the 1st of June to keep out the witches. For in some parts of Europe precisely the same custom is observed, for the same reason, a month earlier on the marriage day of the King and Queen of May. The Greeks certainly believed that branches of whitethorn or buckthorn fastened to a door or outside the house had power to disarm the malignant arts of sorcerers, and to exclude spirits. Hence they hung up branches of it before the door when sacrifices were being offered to the dead, lest any of the prowling ghosts should be tempted to revisit their old homes or to invade those of other people. When the atheist Bion lay dying, he not only caused sacrifices to be offered in his behalf to the gods whose existence he had denied, but got an old hag to mumble incantations over him and to bind magical thongs about his arms. And he had boughs of buckthorn and laurel attached to the lintel to keep back death. However, the evidence as to the rites observed by the Romans on the 1st of June is too slight and dubious to allow us to press the parallel with May Day. At the sacred marriage of Jupiter and Juno in later times, the parts of deities may have been acted by the Flammendalis and the Flaminica. If at any time of the year the Romans celebrated the sacred marriage of Jupiter and Juno, as the Greeks commonly celebrated the corresponding marriage of Zeus and Hera, we may suppose that under the Republic the ceremony was either performed over images of the divine pair or acted by the Flammendalis and his wife, the Flaminica. Before the Flammendalis was a priest of Jove. Indeed, ancient and modern writers have regarded him with much probability as the living image of Jupiter, a human embodiment of the sky god. In earlier times, the Roman king, as representative of Jupiter, would naturally play the part of the heavenly bridegroom at the sacred marriage, while his queen would figure as a heavenly bride, just as in Egypt the king and queen masqueraded in the character of deities, and as at Athens the queen annually wedded the vine god Dionysus. That the Roman king and queen should act the parts of Jupiter and Juno would seem all the more natural because these deities themselves bore the title of king and queen. Even if the office of Flammendalis existed under the kings, as it appears to have done, the double representation of Jupiter by the king and the Flamen need not have seemed extraordinary to the Romans of the time. The Flamen and the Flaminica may have been the deputies of the king and queen. The same sort of duplication, as we saw, appears to have taken place at Alba, where the Julii were allowed to represent the supreme god in the character of little Jupiters, while the royal dynasty of the Silvi continued to wield the divine thunder and lightning. And long ages afterwards, history repeated itself. Another member of the Julian house, the first emperor of Rome, was deified in his lifetime under the title of Jupiter, while a Flamen was appointed to do for him what the Flammendalis did for the heavenly Jove. It is said that Numa, the typical priestly king, at first himself discharged the functions of Flammendalis, but afterwards appointed a separate priest of Jupiter with that title in order that the kings, untrammeled by the burdensome religious observances attached to the priesthood, might be free to lead their armies to battle. The tradition may be substantially correct, for analogy shows that the functions of a priestly king are too harassing and too incongruous to be permanently united in the same hands, and that sooner or later the holder of the office seeks to rid himself of part of his burden by deputing to others according to his temper and tastes, either his civil or his religious duties. Hence we may take it as probable that the fighting kings of Rome, tired of parading as Jupiter and of observing all the elaborate ritual, all the tedious restrictions which the character of Godhead entailed on them, were glad to relegate these pious mummeries to a substitute, in whose hands they left the crozier at home, while they went forth to wield the sharp Roman sword abroad. This would explain why the traditions of the latter kings, from Tullus or Stilius onwards, exhibited so few traces of sacred or priestly functions adhering to their office. Among the ceremonies which they henceforth performed by a deputy may have been the rite of the sacred marriage. At the sacred marriage, the king and queen of Rome probably personated the god and goddess of the oak. Whether that was so or not, the legend of Numa and Egeria appears to embody a reminiscence of a time when the priestly king himself played the part of the divine bridegroom. As we have seen reason to suppose that the Roman kings personated the oak god, while Egeria is expressly said to have been an oak nymph. The story of their union in the sacred grove raises a presumption that at Rome in the regal period ceremony was periodically performed exactly analogous to that which was annually celebrated at Athens down to the time of Aristotle. The marriage of the king of Rome to the oak goddess, like the wedding of the vine god to the queen of Athens, must have been intended to quicken the growth of vegetation by homeopathic magic. Of the two forms of the rite, we can hardly doubt that the Roman was the older, and that long before the northern invaders met with the vine on the shores of the Mediterranean, their forefathers had married the tree god to the tree goddess in the vast oak forests of Central and Northern Europe. In the England of our day, the forests have mostly disappeared, yet still, on many a village green and in many a country lane, a faded image of the sacred marriage lingers in the rustic pageantry of May Day. End of section 9.